Alrighty, hello folks. We are back. We're diving back into the comprehensive event guide. How's everyone doing? I see a couple folks saying hello there. I am excited to get back into whatever this nonsense happens to be. We should just start by scrolling. We left off at Mulligan error in section 3.4. Is it a problem that I already know that Mulligan error is 3.4? Is that maybe a sign that many people have asked me questions about Mulligan error? Maybe. I don't know. But we're going to see if we can find a place where we can relax and read this, because I think we're going to be here for a minute. But that's on page... That's page 70? And we only need to get to, 89? I only have to do 20 pages today? Last time I did 50, right? Where did we start last time? We started on 23 last time and got all the way to 70. So we did 47 pages last time. This is real easy. And by real easy, I mean, well, we're going to talk for a while. Also, before we get started diving into today, I just wanted to address a comment that somebody shot me a message off stream, and they're like, "Hey, sorry for asking so many questions. I hope you don't mind that I'm asking questions." And I want to make something very clear here. I am doing this for you to ask questions. If chat didn't ask questions, and the documents wouldn't get clarified because I wouldn't know which parts are confusing to y'all. And two, this would essentially just be an ASMR read of the comprehensive event guide. And I know that some of you would absolutely listen to an ASMR read of the event guide. And no, I do not have any plans to do an ASMR read of the event. I might do the Relax Policy Guide. If there's enough demand, I might do an ASMR read of the Relax Policy Guide. I don't know how to do an ASMR voice. This is just how I talk. Maybe if I turn the gain down a lot, who knows? Anyway, if you weren't asking questions, then this would just be reading the document and there wouldn't be a whole lot of education. I mean, I will go off on my own tangents to be like, hey, so this is why we split this up into a couple different sections. But really the questions are where a lot of the value of this broadcast comes from. The questions and the concerns. We do still have our revisions, the new revisions. We also have my notes that say do not publish, because this is where we get the notes for the policy clarifications, and these haven't been refined. It's just, hey, let me make a note that there's a problem here and let me deal with it later. But oh boy. Swoop Plan B says I need to do that. All right, that's one vote for ASMR read of the Relax Policy Guide. Mayonnaise says just get really close. I am really close. I don't know if you can see how close to the microphone I am, but my face is actually just in contact with the microphone. I cannot get closer to the microphone. I actually cannot get closer. Anyways, comprehensive game rules read Yule log leaked and confirmed. Can you'll know that's not if you want to do that, please feel free. I'm sure that it would be very popular. Maybe if we just read our favorite sections, maybe we get somebody to read about nested actions and modified abilities. That'd be fun. Hello, Alessandro. Nice to see you again. Anyways, let's dive into Mulligan error. I know that Tennessee Feet Monk has some questions about Mulligan error. So we're going to go over this, and then we're going to talk about some of the questions that were sent to us last time, and I'm going to read them on the other monitor real fast. And by real fast, I mean you're going to read them at the same time I'm reading them, so we get to go through this live. In any case, Mulligan error. Player makes an error in drawing their opening hand or mulliganing. Once both players have resourced and the active player has taken action, it is no longer in the mulligan window. Excess cards are in hand are hidden card manipulation error. Insufficient cards are inaccurate mandatory ability. Unintentional errors that provide no advantage are not infractions. it is so. This is a weird one. Let's just read the philosophy first, and then we'll get into the examples, and then we'll talk about why it's weird. Errors occurring before the start of the game may be addressed with a less disruptive remedy, a forced mulligan, as opposed to the more disruptive hidden card manipulation error remedy, where the player reveals their hand and their opponent picks a card to take out of it. If the opponent can confirm that the player has not seen the faces of the card and there are excess cards, it is no. Oh gosh, I should have had. I was gonna have cards so I could show you things. Instead, we're just gonna grab these tokeny doodles off my desk. What do I have for tokens? We got Mobius, we got Gil, we got a Goblin Shaman. Fantastic. So, this is going to be my hand, front face, back face. And we'll use these props to discuss mulligans. But if the opponent can confirm that the player has not seen the faces of the card and their excess cards, this isn't a significant issue. So if I'm drawing my cards face down, or if I draw 5 cards face down and then 1 card face up, and I'm like, wait a second, or 2 cards face up, and I'm like, wait, this is 7 total cards. Excess face down cards are not part of what we consider. Cards that are face down during the mulligan process are essentially not considered part of the hand. And I think that might be language that helps clarify what we're trying to do here. But if the error is committed after the player has already begun to take a mulligan, the penalty is a game loss. If the player makes a mulligan decision after they are allowed and has begun to take that mulligan, the penalty is a game loss. And then if it is the second time the player has, or third time player's done a mulligan error in the event, it is also a game loss. So there are a lot of ways to get a game loss with mulligan errors. However, it is relatively infrequent that players do screw up mulligans. I've had very, very few mulligan errors. But let's talk about what am I reading here? If the error... So, yeah, we're wide awake. We're wide awake. We've had our caffeine. We haven't had any caffeine. We don't drink caffeine. Anyways, if the error results in excess cards in the player's opening hand after a mulligan, a number of cards equal to the excess are selected at random from the hand and shuffled into the deck. Why is that line there? This is something that I should know better. After a mulligan. Yes. Okay, so if you draw 7 on your first hand, that's going to be a forced mulligan. You go down to 6. If you draw 7, yeah, these two lines are at odds with each other, and this line shouldn't exist. This is why I'm confused. This line is at odds with the upgrade because the player has begun to take a mulligan. And so we have begun to take a mulligan, game loss, after a mulligan, selected at random, shuffled into the deck. This should just be a game loss. And I think this is a cause of a lot of confusion, this extra line, because it is immediately countermanded by the next line. Now, why is it so frequently a game loss? Why do we have 2 upgrades to game loss under different circumstances? It's because that this disadvantage is very hard to address, although there is... This is one that I'm going to have to look at a little bit longer, because right now, if a player realizes that they have mulliganed and then they mulliganed a second time and they realize their own error, they are incentivized to wait until the game starts, then call a judge, and then it becomes a hidden card manipulation error. This is tricky. Hello, ST77M. Hello, Starkiller. I think we're going to do a more broad rework on mulligan error. because there are some weird incentives. It's switching to a card manipulation error when it is often a game loss, incentivizes the player to not call attention to it until a time threshold has passed, rather than calling a judge's attention to it immediately. Because if we call a judge's attention to it immediately, we're generally able to better fix it. But if the player waits, it is no longer a game loss, which might mean that it just needs to be considered a game loss if the game has proceeded at all. If it is excess cards in hand or third mulligan. And I think that's where I'm leaning on the recommendation. FC Mears says, if the player accidentally draws 7 cards but has laid them down flat and not seen them, is there a way to remedy that mulligan issue without the game loss being issued? Yep. Where do we have it? If the opponent can confirm that the player hasn't seen the face of the cards and they're excess cards, so 7 cards. Excess cards can be selected at random and shuffled back into the deck. Because the card faces haven't been seen, no potential advantage has been gained. This should be labeled as a warning, or be more explicit that this is a warning. So let's dive into this list of examples. Alrighty. Player has too many cards and haven't looked. They have 7 cards, haven't looked, shuffle 1 in at random. Too few cards, haven't looked, draw up to the right amount. If they haven't looked, it doesn't even need to be an infraction, because if somebody just counts down 7 cards face down, and then they're like, wait a second, this is too many, we just say, okay, we're going to take one of these cards that you haven't seen, put it back in top of your deck. You should have 6 random cards. You do have 6 random cards. And so there might be some carve-outs for you catching it. Although I don't think we even need to have that carve-out. If it's just, if it is too many cards and you haven't looked at them, just put one back at random. If you have too few cards, drop to the right amount. Too few cards and you have looked, you drop to the right amount, and that is also no infraction. Too many cards, you looked and you have not mulliganed yet, you get a forced mulligan. Too many cards, you did look and have mulliganed already. I'm going to probably petition for this to have the hidden card manipulation error fix, which is very punitive. You have your hand of 6 cards and your opponent, or 7 cards, and your opponent takes the best card out of your starter, and you're not allowed to mulligan. I don't know what the loss rate on that is, but it's not great. If you take a second mulligan, game loss, because you're not allowed to do that, and our only fix after you have shuffled your hand into your deck is for your opponent to create your hand from scratch using the hidden card manipulation error fix. And your opponent giving you a 6-card starting hand is truly abysmal and feels like a game loss without telling you that it's a game loss. Then player then mulligans after opponent makes a choice when they're not supposed to. Again, you are mulliganing when you are not supposed to. That is a game loss. As noted in this comment here, too many cards after first action, hidden card manipulation error, warning instead of game loss. And too few cards after first action, inaccurate mandatory ability. I think it does have to be that, just because we can't be certain that it was an error in drawing your opening hand once the game has started. Swoop Plan B says, make the hidden card manipulation errors have a caveat that if it occurs on the first turn of the game, it is a mulligan error. Can't quite do that. There would be a lot of carve-outs, because it's like hidden card manipulation error on the first turn of the game with cards going from deck to hand, and you haven't had any other sources of cards going from deck to hand, then it's card manipulation error. I think the best way to do it is essentially have two remedies. If the player has not yet begun to take a mulligan, that player takes a mulligan. If they have excess cards, we use the card manipulation error fix. And then, so we have an HCME fix, and then it is not a game loss, and so we lose the exploitable advantage of waiting until the game has started. So, all that is to say, Mulligan Error is going to see a little bit of an overhaul. When I have some time to sit down and put words together and make it look pretty, I will include that in the clarifications above that's a little bit more formal and a little bit more presentable than me rambling on the internet for 10 minutes while you all are like, what is he talking about? About Daniel asks about third mulligan game loss. Should we enforce it as a hard rule? Some offending players might want to have that fix. HCME full hand after third mulligan. Some go banzai or worse, it pressures opponent to saying, no, it's fine, let's draw. So I think that it is incorrect from a policy philosophy standpoint to have the HCME replace the player's starting hand as a fix in policy. Because one, it puts a lot of pressure on the opponent to create a fair game. Because, like, most of the time that this happens, it is going to be an accident. However, this is just one of those things that we can fix it. We can use the hidden card manipulation error fix. But then a lot of players will be like, oh, yeah, just shuffle, draw 6 cards at random. Or I'm going to pick, like, 2 cards, and then the rest you draw at random. So, like, you get kind of screwed, and I know that you're going to resource all of your Avengers, or that I'm just going to be like, yeah, you start your game with 3 Avengers in hand. You're probably going to start by resourcing at least 2 of them. And so I now know that I don't have to deal with those. And it just creates, 1, a very complicated game, and 2, it creates some social pressure to get the opponent to treat the player who made the error fairly. And I think that most of the time when the player correctly ruins their opponent's hand, it is effectively a game loss at the start of the game. And so it doesn't, giving them the option, all it does is create social pressure for the opponent, and does not meaningfully mitigate the error at hand. So, Mulligan Error is going to see some rework. This is probably going to turn into hidden card manipulation error fix. This is, or, yeah. So, step 1, we just have them take a mulligan. If we have drawn extra cards, if we've gone up to 7, opponent. We're thinking about this. This is something I'm going to have to sit down and go to the drawing board on, because there's a lot of permutations, and we want to make sure that we cover them all concisely and effectively without loopholes or exploitable perverse incentives to hold on to errors and that sort of thing. All that is to say, most of the time, we're going to be under the first condition of the players not yet begun to take a mulligan. Tell them to take a mulligan. If they have taken mulligans, it's most likely going to be a game loss. We might be able to figure out a way to fit the hidden card manipulation error fix in there. But generally, it's either going to be, have you taken a mulligan yet? Okay, take a mulligan. You have taken a mulligan yet? Okay, you're going to lose this game because we can't do this without just having your opponent give you a brand new hand. I think there's an option of, like, on the second mulligan, player draws up to 7, we hidden card manipulation error and pull just that one card. So, yeah, I think it's not yet taken a mulligan, take a mulligan. You have taken a mulligan and you have extra card. Or if you have excess cards on first or second mulligan, hidden card manipulation error. Then third mulligan or mulligan when you're not allowed to, game loss. I think that's the fix in the end. Rather than forced mulligan, because if a player draws 7 card open to hand, rather than forced mulligan, we can just say, hey, we're going to hidden card manipulation error fix this. You're going to go down to 6 cards, and then you'll have the option to mulligan. If you just want to mulligan now, we can skip the reveal your hand to your opponent step and go straight to that mulligan. And I think that's probably the best way to do it. However, so as you may be able to tell from how I've dealt with policy since like September, maybe even August of last year, I am a proponent of the hidden card manipulation error fix where the opponent does get to see your hand and does make a choice. There are some people who are members of the organized play team who are also on board with that. Some prefer random and some prefer a game loss, as they feel that the advantage gained from revealing the hand to the non-infracting player is significant. And I think mulligan error is a casualty of that disagreement in philosophy of we're trying to make everybody happy, and we ended up making a little bit of a mess and nobody happy. So I hope that explains absolutely nothing. Let's move on to section 3.5. Alrighty. Incorrect randomization. A player commits an error by randomizing a set of order cards, such as a deck, when not instructed to do so. When the player shuffles non-randomized set of cards, the integrity of the game state has been irreversibly compromised, and either player may gain an advantage from the redistribution of cards throughout the randomized set. Sometimes the player who shuffled is the one gaining the advantage. For example, if we just resolved Darth Vader commanding the First Legion, and we saw a bunch of good cards go to the bottom of our deck and we need those cards back, shuffling grants us an advantage. However, if our opponent mindlessly is like, oh, my opponent just shuffled, because I did shuffle the 8 or 9 cards I put on the bottom of my deck, and then lifted up their deck, it is time for me to cut. If the cards were bad cards, and this is more frequent in search effects that reveal, although I don't think we have to reveal the whole set, though I don't think we have too many of those. The opponent being like, oh, there are bad cards at the bottom of my opponent's deck, I gain an advantage from shuffling them in. So if I shuffle your deck when I'm not supposed to, I am the one getting the game loss. This is because we cannot undo it, and there can be a significant advantage from shuffling away known cards, either top or bottom. This is relatively infrequent, and it happens most frequently with players who complete search effects and then just shuffle those cards into their deck as a reflex carried over from other games. However, since the vast majority of search effects in Star Wars search the top X cards of your deck and then put them on the bottom of your deck, there are games where a player has resolved, say, 2 Darth Vaders, a couple, 2 or 3 Inferno, 4 triggers, and they theoretically know something like the bottom 22 or 23 cards of their deck, which means that, like, if they saw Avengers or other powerful endgame cards or powerful events, whether they be cheap events or expensive events, because Vader doesn't care, they know what the bottom half of their deck is, and therefore they know what they're not going to be drawing soon. In other games where shuffle the whole deck is a little bit more frequent, this is less disruptive, but it is pretty significant. However, if I pick up my deck, I look at the top card of the deck, put it back, draw it because I'm supposed to, and then my opponent, for whatever reason, shuffles my entirely unknown deck, entirely randomized deck, we can downgrade it. Or if we just resolved a restock and we put 4 cards on the bottom of the deck, we know what those cards are. We can repair it perfectly, and so we can and should do that. Similarly, if a player commits this error and is like, oh crap, I should not have done that, we do want to downgrade it for players who catch the errors themselves. Cascade 2244 says, I think we are kind of past the point where we should be generous as a general rule for players moving from other card games. I think that, generally speaking, you want players to be playing your game correctly. However, it is important from a policy philosophy standpoint to be accepting of players. Like, if a player is making this mistake and they've been playing for a long time and they're like, yeah, I've been playing Star Wars Unlimited since launch, so I've been playing for 2 years. However, I've been playing Pokemon for 2 decades before that. You've been playing Star Wars Unlimited for 2 years. You should know how it works. However, having policy that is vigorous against new players makes it harder for the game to continue to grow. If a community is exclusionary to newcomers, it makes it harder to get newcomers and for the game to continue to grow. Now, should players who are playing their first couple of games be playing at a competitive event? Wouldn't be my recommendation. However, a lot of players who play competitive TCGs like the competition, and so when they find a new game they like, they're like, I want to play this competitively. And so they go to play competitive events because they know they do not enjoy the more casual atmosphere of something like weekly play. And being accepting and welcoming to those new players in some regards is very important. But in any case, the infraction here is a game loss, which is definitely less generous and welcoming. Alrighty, illegal gameplay. A player makes an error in gameplay that does not fit the definition of another gameplay disruption. It says this covers the majority of in-game errors. I think inaccurate mandatory ability probably covers more. IMA and IG are 2 exceptionally broad infractions. Illegal gameplay is effectively actually just everything. However, we want to find, as we mentioned earlier, the most specific thing. For example, mulligan error, you could say, is a hidden card manipulation error. However, mulligan error is more precise, and so we're going to go with mulligan error. But inaccurate mandatory ability covers doing stuff that you were instructed to incorrectly, whereas inaccurate gameplay or illegal gameplay is doing stuff incorrectly that you are not prompted to do. So resolves a trigger and spending too much, spending too few. There isn't an ability that is prompting you to do that. Claiming the initiative, breaking game rules of your own volition rather than incorrectly resolving things is illegal gameplay. Again, we consider simple backup. We consider resolve now. So we do have the note that while resolving now can be considered frequently, illegal gameplay is not an element of gameplay that was missed, but rather something that shouldn't have happened. If we look at all of these examples, spending too many resources is not something that we can resolve now and just ready the resource. Similarly, a player underpaying something falls under illegal gameplay as opposed to mandatory ability. And that can be resolved now. But if we underpaid for something and did not have the resources for it, let's say we spent 4 on a Vanquish instead of 5, we can't simply resolve that now and be like, yeah, we'll just double exhaust one of your resources. We do have to back up. Note that if the opponent has had reasonable opportunity to notice the error, the opponent has also committed an infraction. Most of the time, this will result in a tracking penalty for mutual responsibility. We're going to talk about this before we get back to the rest of illegal gameplay. Um, Mutual responsibility errors are to help track player behavior uh, when somebody isn't calling out their opponent's mistakes. We generally want players to call attention as soon as they notice their opponent make a mistake for a couple of reasons. One, big reason is we want games to be natural and to have natural outcomes. And we want players to call a judge as soon as they notice an error, because the closer we are to the point of the error, the easier it is for us to address said error, right? It is easier to perform a simple backup of just, oh yeah, put that back in your hand, rather than, okay, so we're going to undo your attack, then we're going to take the unit that you just defeated, put that back into play, then we're going to take the unit that was defeated with the vanquish that was illegally played, return that, we're going to unresolve that trigger, and then we're going to undo the vanquish. It is the sooner we catch it, the easier it is to address things, and the easier it is to get a natural game state. And therefore, we want the opponents to call out errors. However, we don't want to make it so that you can get game lost out of the match or out of an event by your opponent making errors. So this is going to be a tracking penalty rather than a warning. Furthermore, we generally expect a player to have a more comprehensive understanding of their own cards than their opponent. And so, for example, not noticing that your opponent attached a fallen lightsaber, which says attached to a non-vehicle unit, until they're attacked with it, the player who played fallen lightsaber is more responsible in that case than the player who did not play fallen lightsaber, because they don't know necessarily what that card does. As we say, these are tracking penalties because it is frequently easy to misunderstand your opponent's cards or miss a temporarily visible error, such as an opponent looking at too many cards. If it was warnings, players would also just not call for judges and fix things themselves. However, we want to incentivize opponents to call for judges. Therefore, tracking penalties does not upgrade. However, if a player regularly calls for a judge when their opponent does something illegal that disadvantages the player who calls for the judge, and regularly does not when their opponent commits an error that advantages that same player, an investigation for cheating may be warranted. Similarly, if a player, some errors are harder to resolve as the game goes on. If a player, for example, overpays for something, but we've gone through a regroup, or a player defeats a unit that wasn't supposed to have been defeated, right? They just assign too much damage onto their own unit or what have you, and the opponent just lets it happen. And then they wait a while to call attention to it, and it gets to the point where the resolution is leave as is, because resolving now does not work. Resolving now is too disruptive, and rewinding is not possible. A player who sits on a penalty, they may have been aware sooner and been like, oh, if I just wait another turn cycle, this won't be able to be fixed, but I can get a warning from my opponent, and if my opponent's already received a warning or two, this might upgrade to a game loss. It's value to me to sit on this infraction. That's something that we want to be conscious of, although that is not something that happens terribly frequently. So, going back to illegal gameplay, we just finished saying that we don't want players to be able to create errors. I see your question, Daniel, which is why I got sidetracked, but we were just talking about how we don't want players to get in trouble for their opponent's behaviors or for their opponent's cards. However, if your opponent does the thing that creates the rule that makes your action illegal, you are both equally responsible. So, for example, Kira and Regional Governor change how you can legally play cards. Something like Sentinel. The player is responsible for ensuring that their opponent makes a legal attack. Um, Making sure that your events like Waylay are resolved correctly are important. What else is there? There are a bunch of other examples. I know I have some of them in my head. Um, gosh, the Star Destroyer that removes text from the first event played each round. That's another one that is the responsibility of both players. If I play an event and resolve it, I should be penalized because I resolved an event that should not have resolved. I did an event that did not exist. But my opponent is also responsible because it is their game rule, not the comprehensive rules. And so if a player has an effect that creates a game rule that is not the comprehensive rules, Sentinel is going to be relatively common, and that's a small issue. Similarly, like effects like Waylay, occasionally a player will put it in the wrong zone, but I think that's going to be relatively infrequent. I think most of the time it's going to be attacking while there's a Sentinel or something with the Sentinel, or attacking into hidden. Notably, if I go attack, this is a and then you're like, no, I have Sentinel, you can't do that. The player who's like, no, I have a Sentinel, is not responsible. It's only if we resolve the attack, damage goes through, and then we've proceeded. So the note that we have here is the opponent has had reasonable opportunity to notice the error. This is essentially going to be the next discrete action, or the next time the player has participated in the game. So if the player takes an action, resolves a trigger, goes to regroup and regroups, any of these are lines where the player needs to be engaged in the game, and therefore they are mutually responsible. And I think adding a more clean line, probably in either mutual responsibility or illegal gameplay, is useful. Let me see if I can get this into my notes. Better define reasonable opportunity, not measurable opportunity, in illegal gameplay. Because there are some pretty firm lines that we can use for that. For example, if I claim the initiative and then my opponent does something illegal with their first action and then proceeds to take 3 or 4 more actions, and then I'm like, hold on. Wasn't that first thing you did illegal? I haven't been an active participant in the game. I've not needed to do anything. And so it is, while players should be paying attention to their game, if they are not actively doing anything in the game, they're very frequently strategizing and looking at the cards in their hand, or looking at their resources, thinking about what they're going to do next, thinking about what card they're going to resource when they draw, and not thinking about what their opponent is doing. So as long as they verify that the game is legal the next time they step into it, that's the line we're looking for. Alrighty. DeCaniel says, what would you think about not informing players about tracking penalty? I'm feeling that it can give a lot of repressive atmosphere because it's about hunting cheating patterns and is very infrequent. I think that generally it's not something that I bring up frequently. Also note that most of the time the opponent does catch it pretty quickly. And so I think just being like, hey, you're going to get a warning, this can upgrade, and you're going to get a tracking penalty, this doesn't upgrade, it's just tracking your behavior. Just let them know that we're just like Spotify or Google, and we just want to collect data and see what's happening. I think that you should let players know about tracking penalties. This is a change in personal philosophy, but it doesn't hurt to let them know. However, when issuing a tracking penalty, you should communicate clearly about what it means, because a lot of players are going to be, oh no, I have a warning. And if you just say, hey, doesn't escalate. So tracking penalties, players are informed. It is important to remind them that they do not escalate. Um, that's what I'm going to do here. And I think, honestly, the vast majority of the time, I'm not issuing a tracking penalty because it is caught so quickly. I still want to let the player know, hey, you're going to get a warning and you are going to get a tracking penalty, just because it encourages players to also call judges a little bit more. It does create a little bit of a situation of I got in trouble for calling attention to a thing, but really, I don't love calling it a tracking penalty. But that's the name that we have as derived from 0 point tracking penalty, as opposed to the escalated, severe, extreme, and warning penalties that we had before. Now that we just have tracking and warning, the nomenclature doesn't make as much sense, but it's leftover language, and changing it is, I think, a significant overhaul that isn't necessary. If we just go in and say, hey, it's your job to point this thing out as soon as you notice it, we're just noting that time has passed since this error occurred. It's nothing to worry about unless you're cheating. Are you cheated? No? All right, cool. Then don't worry about it. I don't think I've had that exact conversation with a player before, but something very similar to it of, hey, judge, I don't think I should get a penalty for my opponent's error. And just being like, okay, that's entirely reasonable. Note that this penalty doesn't do anything unless you're cheating. And they're like, oh, okay. I'm not worried about that then. Like, if you explain warnings, upgrade to game losses after repeated infractions. Tracking penalties do not upgrade. It is there in the name. It is just for tracking purposes. It is just paperwork that I have to do. I think that's also a great way to explain to players. If somebody's like, hey, so why am I getting a penalty? You're just like, I am letting you know that this is going on your temporary record. It does not go on your permanent record, because a permanent record doesn't exist. It's just really paperwork that I have to do, and I'm letting you know that I'm doing some paperwork on your behalf. And I think a lot of players will be like, oh, this is just busy work that you have to do. It doesn't meaningfully impact me. Yep, that's the correct answer from the player perspective. It is not busy work. It does have meaningful value to the judge side of things. But I think calling it a busy work or paperwork or bureaucracy is a good way to explain it. Headkin asks how much we got left. We've got Section 4, Event Disruptions, Section 5, Unsporting Conduct to go through. We're making good time. We've only been at this for 45 minutes. Daniel says, okay, so focus on a shared conclusion. Player gets a warning, and we take note in case opponent has repeat behavior. Would you be open on actually not labeling it as a penalty? I think it would save some time for the I don't deserve a penalty debate with anxious players. I think I'd be like, I think most of the time my language is going to be like, hey, so you're going to be getting a warning for illegal gameplay because you paid $7 for something that costs $8, and that's not allowed. Opponent goes, yeah, I understand. And you're going to be receiving a tracking penalty because you let your opponent do something illegal, and we just want to encourage you to keep us aware of errors as soon as they happen. If you called us as soon as it happened, there wouldn't be anything here. Switching to tracking citation, definitely a possibility. I don't hate that. Also, Headkin says, me hoping not to give too many tracking penalties so I don't have to do paperwork. Thankfully, a lot of times, scorekeeping software has, after you issue a penalty to one player, it says, would you like to also issue a penalty to the other player? And you say yes, and then you just select tracking penalty, and it copies the description, but it says let opponent, and then whatever your initial description was. So it's not actually that much paperwork. But yeah, focus on the shared conclusion, and I would be open on not calling tracking penalties. Tracking citation, or just like a tracking check. We're just making a note of this, a tracking note, something along those lines. But I think something that will help is that many other games, it is a warning and a non-escalating warning, but both players get warnings, and that is concerning for players. Whereas warning and tracking, Warning sounds like, hey, you're in trouble, you're getting a warning. Tracking is just what the internet does to you all the time. It's not a thing to worry about. But let's move on to event disruptions. So, yeah, exactly. It's a cookie. We could call them tracking cookie. Oh my god. Cookie penalties? I kind of want to call them cookie penalties now. If we ever have a judge-only tournament, I am absolutely calling them cookie penalties. And I think at the end of the event, you get cookies in inverse proportion to the number of cookie penalties you've received. That way, we incentivize players not creating errors. If you got cookies every time you had a cookie penalty, that would create some very bad incentives. But gameplay disruption section 3 are when players break the comprehensive rules. Event disruptions are when somebody breaks the event. This is generally in violation of tournament regulations as opposed to in violation of the comprehensive rules. Notably, most event disruptions upgrade to a game loss at the second infraction as opposed to the third. The reason we have 2 instead of 3 is because a lot of event disruptions are, 1, more disruptive than gameplay disruptions, and 2, a lot of them don't repeat. And so the reason we escalate 2 game losses is because penalties need to have some weight behind them. If all we did was shake our finger at players and say, don't do that again, there isn't any incentive for players to either improve their behavior or to not try and risk it for more malicious behavior. Whereas if there is a probability or a likelihood of a game loss happening, that is a strong incentive for players. With gameplay disruptions, it is much more feasible for a player to get multiple gameplay disruptions. It is, I don't know if you've ever kept track of your genuine errors, but the number of times you're going to receive an inaccurate mandatory ability or illegal gameplay, it's a lot. But event disruptions. Alrighty. Tardiness. Showing up late to something is a problem. Don't be late. There isn't really a fix other than giving a time extension. The lines are if somebody is late, it's a warning. If it's more than 5 minutes late, but less than 10 minutes, upgrades to a game loss. If it's the second time, also a game loss. If they're more than 10 minutes late, it's a match loss. If the player isn't present, they are dropped. If they are present, they're not dropped. This also notes that other things can fall into tardiness, such as not submitting deck lists or not being able to find card replacements. Being prepared for your round or event is correct. Note that we do have the carve out if a round was scheduled to, or begins before it was scheduled to end. Tardiness is calculated from when it was scheduled to begin or when the previous round was scheduled to end rather than the new, more recent time. So if player does what they're supposed to, looks at the clock and says, okay, I just need to be back by 2 o'clock, and then the round starts at 1:50, player isn't going to get in trouble for doing what they were supposed to. Similarly, if a player's like, hey, I need to use a restroom or find replacements or sleeves, we give them 10 minutes. Note that this is one of the few places where we give players a hard line. This is because they are simply not present at the match, and we need to be able to give them a hard line of, rather than having it be vibes of, yeah, I feel like you used the restroom in a reasonable amount of time, we're not going to issue a match loss, or this was unreasonable. We simply just go to the, if we spend more than 10 minutes, it is too disruptive to the event to continue. Now, we say that like this 10 minutes is a pretty significant disruption. We theoretically could continue, but the reason this exists is the vast majority of the time where a player does not show up within the first 10 minutes, it is because they are not going to show up. And so it's not so much about the time extension, because we as judges will issue time extensions much longer than 10 minutes. As soon as we get down to deck checks in a couple of minutes, we'll be talking about longer extensions. But because we want to treat the opponent who is present fairly. And we're not going to just say, hey, sit there for 35 minutes and twiddle your thumbs while we wait for your opponent to show up when we are confident that they're not going to show up. This 10-minute limit is somewhat derived from other games. A lot of games have this 10-minute limit. It might be appropriate for it to be longer or shorter, depending on the habits of players. But generally, 10 minutes is a good line for knowing when. I've seen a non-zero number of players show up with 7, 8, 9 minutes into the round. The number of players who show up after that is so small. I do also see some games upgrading to game loss closer to 0 or 1 minutes late. 5 minutes is very generous to players, but also most players who show up quickly do show up within the first minute or two. And if a player is regularly late, they're going to be receiving game losses anyways as the infraction upgrades. Headkin says, interesting game loss from the PQ on Saturday. Players finished the games. Player A captured Player B's unit. While cleaning up after the match, Player A accidentally picks up Player B's card. Player A drops for the tournament, goes home. Later in the tournament, Player A calls the venue to inform them what happened. Player B's deck got deck checked because of this and finds they are missing one card. Game loss issued. Venue had a copy of the card and replaced it for them. Headkin says it was limited, so it was some random common. Yeah, if we are at the beginning of a round, probably deck check them. If we are at the towards the tail end of a round or between rounds, I page the player and say, hey, are you missing a card? You should get it replaced and probably not issue an infraction. Because this is an infraction we can avoid, and it is probably, we can be pretty confident that it is not Player B's intention to do this. And they don't really have a lot of options to remedy it. We do want players to count their deck and make sure they have a legal deck, but I think that there's a way that we could also potentially, like, there are a lot of circumstances where just check the player, make sure the deck is correct. Similarly, if like the player noticed the error and was like, oh, I just guess I'll grab whatever my 30th pick was for deck construction and just throw that in there instead so I have a legal deck and I'm not going to worry about it. That's something that we want to know. So checking the deck is definitely useful. But if the player's not in the round, just call them up and be like, hey, did you have a card captured by an opponent? Do you still have that card? Is it gone forever? Well, that player's at home and they have an extra common. Let's see if we can get that fixed for you so you are playing with your legal deck. Our goal is to prevent cheating and to have games have natural outcomes. And so if we are able to identify that this player has a problem with their deck before they start playing with the problem deck, we can create a natural game when an unnatural game would have occurred without our intervention. And so that is something that we encourage people to do. It also encourages players to come find judges between rounds if they think they might be missing a card. Because if we just replace it and move them along, fantastic, that makes their life a lot easier. Whereas if they come to us and say, hey, I have a problem with my deck, I'm trying to do the right thing, and we're like, cool, we're going to fix it, but we're also going to hit you with a game loss. You probably shouldn't have just come to us and just should have fixed it on your own. That's worse for us. Speaking of deck error, players presented a deck in sideboard that is not legal or does not match their submitted deck list. A deck that is not legal between matches is not considered presented. And then we have the list of things that are considered to be part of the sideboard, with a few exceptions. Common bases used as tokens, cards that were distributed as part of the tournament. Note that if like players receive a participation pack, the cards in that pack were distributed as part of the tournament. That does get awkward if you get like a participation pack as a prize and you're playing in a limited event. But because it's very easy to accidentally mix that unsleeved pack with your unsleeved sideboard. But it is cleaner to just not penalize players who just have the cards that we gave them in the box that they brought. Because not every player brings a backpack with 27 deck boxes. Some players will show up with a deck box that is sleeved and nothing else. Especially, we particularly don't want to penalize players for having promos in their deck box. Another asterisk is like, if we give everybody a, I don't know, an Amidala promo, and a player's like, oh, I'm running Amidala in my deck, can I swap out my initial card for Amidala? Yes, that card that is the same version of their promo and they swap the card 1-for-1, that's also fine. Tell them to not do it. But it is effectively, you have a promo that we gave you in your deck box. Cards that are in a separate section of the deck box that is not accessed during the match. It needs to have its own lid and container. If it is wholly inaccessible, we don't count it. Cards that are required for clarification purposes, i.e. signed cards, translation cards, judge-issued proxies, all of those are fine. It is better to call these out initially. Just be like, hey, I have this signed card. Some of the text is obscured. I have a couple extra copies of it in my deck after the match. If you don't see those cards, I'll show you the extra cards in my deck box and the signed cards so you know what I have. And so you know that I was not a cheat. You don't need to show them initially. However, the best way to get around all of this is everything in your deck box doesn't count as your sideboard if you point to a pile of cards and say, those cards are my sideboard. So, if sideboard cards are missing, don't issue a penalty. If somebody registered 10 sideboard cards and has 0, that's not a problem. You don't need to have your sideboard to present a legal deck. All you need is the 50 cards you registered, or 60 if you're in data vault. Not having a sideboard is not a problem. A card in dramatically different color sleeves than the rest of the deck is not considered part of the deck when determining draw deck legality. So if a player has, like if a player shuffles and presents and they have a bunch of red sleeves and then a single yellow sleeve, because it's a card that they accidentally picked up from their opponent, or it's some other weird, like it's their promo that somehow got shuffled in, we can just ignore that. If the card is unsleeved and somehow in the deck, we can ignore that. Like, that card does not belong in that deck. It is very obvious. If you need to check the deck list to be like, does this card belong? This is teal versus turquoise versus seafoam blue. Like, those sleeves are very similar, and somebody might see them as the same color. Consider them part of the same deck. Use it for draw deck legality and for mark cards. Daniel says, I think we already talked about it in part 2 or on Discord. Will we clarify in the document about double pods and that second deck is okay? So, there are 2 key types of double deck pods. There are the deck pods that have one lid, that if you remove the lid, both decks are accessible. That sort of deck pod is not acceptable unless you also present your sideboard, because once you remove the lid, the cards in both pods or both containers are accessible. If you have one of the ones that has 3 lids, I think it's the Squire that has 3 lids. Anyways, if you have one of the ones that has multiple lids and you can remove one lid and access the deck and the other deck is still contained, that is acceptable because the other deck is not accessible. So separate section deck box that is not accessed during the match. The idea behind this policy is that the player isn't, we don't want players to have to focus on where the opponent is rooting around. If like a player goes into a second deck box or into their bag, this is clearly a problem and is very easy to notice. But a player going to their deck pod or deck box and pulling out an extra card or two that were like behind a little divider, that isn't as obvious. And we don't want players to have to watch their opponent like a hawk during sideboarding. Hedkin says, going back to before, Venue issued judge proxies for all foils that players were using during the build phase, so that was fun. I wouldn't do that by default. I would say if you're concerned about your foils warping, call for a judge, and then issue proxies as necessary, but I wouldn't by default replace all foils with proxies, because that seems like an excess, and also most cards don't come out of packs already warped, so you're probably fine. Swoop Plan B said, had a player with a giant box that holds 15 decks, asked where his sideboard is, and he takes it out. Deck box was completely empty except for the sideboard. Fantastic. Hedkin says they were Pringles as soon as the packs were opened. Yep, fantastic. We're issuing proxies there because we gave them that product. They could not have come to the event and not had those cards not be warped. We got to make sure that these players have playable cards. Pain in the butt, but something you got to do sometimes. So, deck error is a game loss. One second. Aha. Formatting error. I found it. Example should be after the downgrade and deck error. I knew that was a thing. So, as we've discussed, a player having the deck they did not register is a pretty significant advantage. It is also difficult to detect. So, it being impossible for the opponent to catch is like the opponent does not know whether or not a player has a legal deck, or they don't know whether or not a player has a deck that matches their deck list. A player can sometimes identify an illegal deck. For example, if a player plays 4 Greedos, you know that it's not legal because there's only one card named Greedo. You can't have 4 of them. But if a player is running 4 Greedos and they draw the 4th one, they can just resource it or keep it in their hand and hide that information. And so it is still a very difficult to detect error, and it can be a significant advantage. Furthermore, if it is an illegal deck and not simply failure to desideboard, it's going to happen once in the event. Like, this player is not going to receive multiple deck errors. We're going to go through their deck. We're going to remove the banned or suspended cards. We're going to remove the 4 ofs and cut them down to 3 ofs. We're going to make the deck legal. However, that's if we do our job right. That's not going to happen again during the tournament. And so, because the problem is infrequent and because players cannot or opponents cannot identify them without information that they are not entitled to, the penalty needs to start at a game loss for most issues. However, at a competitive tier event, if this is the first time a player during the event has committed this infraction and the player called attention to their own error, issue a warning. This is essentially if a player forgets to desideboard and they called it on themselves, just issue a warning. The second time they fail to desideboard, it does upgrade to a game loss. This process is... So, this is the downgrade. Here's the remedy. The remedy is pretty wordy. So, first, we fix the deck as best we can. If there are cards missing, we find them. Generally, they are in the sideboard, and illegal cards are in the deck. We reveal those cards, both all the cards missing and all the cards incorrect, and the opponent chooses where those cards go. So, for example, if the issue is discovered because the player was in the middle of a search effect and they're like, oh crap, judge, this card is a sideboard card, the opponent gets to choose which card goes into the middle of resolving that search effect and which card goes into the rest of the deck. Or like if it's discovered when there's a card in hand, the opponent chooses which card goes into the hand, because theoretically the missing card would have been replaced by one of these sideboard cards. This card should be in their hand, and it lets the opponent know it does give the opponent some information advantage. The idea there is that it helps the opponent confirm that no shady business is going on. Most other remedies, like rewinds or resolve now, the opponent has visibility on it. With a deck problem, when we're moving cards from deck to sideboard, there isn't visibility on that, and we want to have some visibility on that so that the opponent isn't to help mitigate any concerns the opponent has of bias. If we are still missing cards in the deck, and there are not replacements, and replacements can be cards in the player's backpack or binder, cards that they borrow from friends, cards that they're able to get from a vendor real fast. We select cards at random from the sideboard and added to the appropriate zones. Deck lists should be edited to note these changes. The changes from adding in sideboard cards can be undone. It's not something that you're stuck with. And then if you are not able to find appropriate replacements, we talk about this above when we talk about remedies, it does end up being a match loss because you do not have a legal deck. If you're somehow missing 12 cards and your sideboard is 10 cards, because that's how big sideboards get, we're not able to just let you pick new cards for your deck. This is one of the reasons I'm a proponent of resource tokens, because it lets us just say, here, you have a do-nothing card. You'll still be able to play the tournament. But I think that I want to restructure this a little bit so that like the downgrade is clear, and then put the remedy, I think, if we scroll up, where is it? Yeah, replacing cards in decks. I can probably just include the fix in section 2.9 and make this downgrade, just cut out half of this downgrade. DeCaniel says credit tokens next says. Yes, credit tokens exist, but they are different from they're different in my mind from a resource. Maybe I talk to... No, because... So the problem with saying you're allowed to put credit tokens into your deck means you're allowed to put a card into your deck that has cost 0 and defeat this at a resource. And if you could just put those into your deck, some people would put them into your deck and actually play those as cards. So we can't use credit tokens. Swoop Plan B says, here's your chance to add issue judge proxy resource tokens. That's something that I want to do, but resource tokens need to exist before we can create proxies of them, and approvals of that is something that takes a while. DeCaniel says, also, in Bilbao, it didn't happen in the end, but if someone lost a card, we would take at random from played aspects colors. I think that is something we discussed as a correct change after these documents were finalized. And so that's something that came from practical experience, because we did an event and we're like, oh, hey, this is a clear improvement. And just putting that in helps address it. Of course, eventually we're going to run out of... It's very possible that the player's playing a very thin color pool and like their deck is what they have and everything else is off aspect. And at that point, we just take randomly. But yeah, we can cover that as well. Alrighty. Deck list error. A player submitted a deck list that is illegal or does not represent what they intend to play. Deck lists need to be correct. Essentially the same philosophy here as a deck problem. This is something that is not going to happen frequently, and opponents can't really catch it. Therefore, the penalty needs to be a game loss. Otherwise, it has no teeth. You want to make sure that when you're looking at a deck list, if a card is identified somewhat ambiguously, the head judge gets to decide whether or not it's ambiguous. This is something that they can delegate to their team leads or deck check leads, or theoretically even floor judges, but generally, as precedent is still being set, it's not something I would recommend delegating. It also is a question of understanding like meta balance. So we say this should be determined by only looking at the deck list. It says not looking at the cards or asking the player's intent. This should be not looking at the deck, because you are allowed to look at the cards themselves. For example, the classic example we have is Karis versus Karis Nemec. You can look at the two cards and be like, okay, well, this player's playing Aggression Heroism. They're playing Karis Nemec. They're not playing Karis. This is obvious and unambiguous. So I'm just going to select this. Oh, boy. We also want to fix this. So here's a question. A player has registered 3 takedowns, but they are playing 3 vanquishes. The deck and deck list are otherwise the same. So I register 47 cards and 3 takedown. I am playing 47 card and 3 vanquish. Is this a deck list error or a deck error? In both cases, it is a game loss, but the question is, when we fix it, what are we removing from the deck or deck list? If it is a deck list error, we match the deck, and if it's a deck error, we match the deck list. So, this is a question for chat. Player registers 3 of card X, is playing 3 of card Y. Which card should end up on both the deck and deck list? Swoop Plan B says deck error. Why do you say it is deck error? I'm going to just give this is pop quiz. I know you were expecting me to talk the whole time, but I want y'all to talk a little bit sometimes too. Why do you say it's deck error? This is a complex question that doesn't necessarily have a... Headkin asks, what was the question? So, if you have both a legal deck and a legal deck list, but they do not match, is it a deck list error or a deck error? For example, we say we're playing 3 of card X on our deck list. We are actually playing 3 of card Y. Is the deck illegal and we make it match the deck list, or is the deck list incorrect and we make it match the deck? This is... DeCaniel says, I hate this situation. ST77M also says deck error. Swoop Plan B says, because the fix better solves the issue, we're going to resolve it and fix it. The deck is more important than the list. So this sounds a little bit like... Headkin says deck list error since we can only go off what is presented physically. Interesting. Swoop Plan B, your answer sounds a little bit like remedy shopping. You're like, okay, this is the remedy I want, therefore this is the penalty that applies. This is a tough conversation, and in some places it... So, DeCaniel says, check for player intent. Use telepathy as much as possible. Knowing the meta and if the deck list makes no sense or the deck makes no sense helps to choose which one is indeed the correct one. But player intent is what I'm looking for, and that's why I hate it, because if I mess it up, the player will go, oh, I choose this penalty. So this is a tough one, and it creates... So if we go by player intent, frequently a player presenting a deck is what they intended to play. Particularly at the beginning of the day, it is reasonable to believe that the player was making some changes last minute, changed their deck list, but didn't actually change the deck. And so the deck, like in round 1, maybe even round 2, they haven't seen the cards that they did not intend to play. In round 7, it's harder to believe that they haven't seen those cards. So if we say it is a deck error, that means that we hold them to whatever the deck list says, which is very reasonable. However, a lot of the times what a player has in their deck is what they wanted to play. Because... And so if we say it's a deck list error, we fix the deck. And that is the clean answer, because that is a document that was submitted to us before a deadline, can't be changed. It is hard to take advantage of submitting a deck list incorrectly so that you can change your deck down the road. If we say what you presented is what you intend to play and your deck list doesn't matter, and therefore call this a deck list error, it does open a window for advantage, because it allows me to go, okay, I'm going to submit a deck list that is good against hard control decks. I show up and I realize that the format has switched to mono aggro everywhere, and I switch a couple of cards, and now I'm playing something that is much better against aggro lists. If we say, okay, the infraction here is a deck, your deck is correct, therefore your deck list is wrong, and therefore we will fix your deck list. That allows players to effectively change their deck construction during the event for the price of a game loss. If we go the other way around and say, I don't care what you tell me you want to play, the deck list is you telling me what you want to play. This is a deck error. We're going to make it match the deck. That is a lot harder to take advantage of, because players are not able to edit their deck lists after tournament play begins. So we get into this uncomfortable situation of, the majority of the time, from the player perspective, it is a deck list error, and the cards that they have in front of them is in fact the deck that they want to play, and the deck list is wrong. However, if we say that the deck list is wrong, and that the deck is correct, that creates an opening for players to pretty much cheat or switch their deck at will, at least until they get caught once in the event. If they do it again, then we have serious questions of, hey, we already issued you this problem. You can't be telling me that your main deck has changed again in this tournament. Hedkin says, I'm thinking of whatever keeps the tournament moving. The deck error trying to find replacement cards would slow down the event and lead to further penalties. So my recommendation is to generally treat this as a deck error, because it minimizes the opportunity for a player to gain advantage by taking advantage of policy. This does suck, because it is going to have a logistical impact. You do need to find replacement cards to match the submitted deck list. And most of the time the player is going to be like, but that's not what I wanted to play. I obviously wouldn't be playing Blizzard Force AT-AT. I wanted to play Reinforcement Walker or an actually playable card, not something from Intro Battle Hoth. and you're like, sorry, this is a playable card in your deck. I could see somebody making the choice to play it. It is frustrating, but with deck registration tools such as they are, players are able to, for example, hover over the names of cards to see the actual card they registered. They can get, like, I think there's a one button press on Melee that shows you a screenshot, not of your deck list, but of the cards in your deck, so you can visually confirm, which to me is easier than looking at a bunch of names. And so if it is both the deck and deck list are legal but do not match, I would generally call it a deck list error. It doesn't make me happy. But note, a player has presented a deck in sideboard that is not legal and does not match their submitted deck list. So this is legal, does not match their submitted deck list. Argument for deck error. Here, they've submitted a deck list that is illegal, does not represent what they intend to play. Per policy, it could be either. I believe the correct answer is deck list error. It's gross, and it is one where you have to think about not only the philosophy and the logistics, but where players can take advantage of policy. I think adding something a little bit explicit into definition and philosophy and saying it is definitely deck list error is probably a good thing to do. So look at that. We're improving policy. This is going to be one that's a feel bad very frequently, and I apologize for that. But hey, that's the life sometimes. Alrighty. Mark cards. This one's nice and straightforward, and there's never any questions about this one. DeCaniel says, I think the timing is important if it's round one or not. Most of these, in my experience, was early in the event, and the abuse is kind of lower. I think I mostly agree, but that also depends on the timing of when deck list registration was closed. Some events, particularly larger events, have deck list registration close the night before the event. Something like Galactics has the error close, or has registration close the night before, and at that point you have like a 12-hour window to people might talk about their deck list online, what they're playing, the spicy tech. I also don't think it is correct to have, I think in lessons and conversations like this, we can absolutely be like, yeah, it matters in round one or not, if it's round one or not, and this is a place for relatively common deviation. But I don't necessarily think the opportunity for abuse is lower at the beginning of the event. I think it's just like more likely that a player has not noticed an error. DeCaniel also says, decklist error about the game loss for decklist error, going a little into Limited World again. I've got multiple judges of all levels of experience saying that the game loss for missing leader base feels bad as the possibility for abuse is less since it's option of leaders. One judge proposed to just fix the deck list if we manage to identify the missing leaders in time for round one, game one. Intuitively, the fact that the leaders are super public lower the traditional abuse and need game loss here. Yes. This is something that we did. I think we did this in Philadelphia. And we definitely did do, like, a lot of people did not register a common base, but they were playing a blue leader and red cards and didn't have a rare red base. And so I think I don't think it needs to. I'd So you say one judge proposed to just fix the deck list if we manage to identify the missing leaders in time for round one, game one. And uh, I don't think we need to even be that harsh. I think if when we look at the deck list, we are able to identify the leader in base, uh, simply by looking at the deck list, that's okay. Notably, this can only happen in limited. This cannot happen in constructed because the possibility of a rare base, even if a player's playing 60 cards, like if they have Anakin but don't register Data Vault, they theoretically could be playing 60 card 30 for whatever crazy reason. But I do think having a carve out for limited leaders and bases where it is possible to, from the list of registered cards, deterministically identify the leader and base is perfectly reasonable. I think in Philadelphia we had like 15, at least a dozen, maybe 15 errors where players did not register these sorts of things. And we got it, like looking at the lists, we managed to get it down to like, I think 2 where it was not obvious what the leader base combo was. And so we needed to issue a game loss and get that information from the player. But yes, I strongly agree putting a carve out into it. And again, this is one of those changes that has occurred since we have run limited events, and improvement that we can see in the future. Alrighty, mark cards. We're going to drink a little bit because I've been talking for an hour and a half and my throat is starting to feel pain again, like it did the last time I talked for 6 hours straight. Alrighty. Mark cards. Over the course of a tournament or several tournaments, a sleeve or card may become marked in a way that will allow the player to distinguish it from the others in their deck. This includes scuff marks, discoloration, warped sleeves, or damaged cards. That's pretty straightforward. Sleeves and cards can often become worn or damaged over the course of an event, especially in a longer tournament. Very true. As long as the player is not attempting to take advantage of this wear and tear, remedying this situation is enough in most cases. Keep in mind that any card can be considered marked if they are inspected closely enough. I have had people looking very closely at decks and finding marked cards that are not practical for a player to evaluate in like a real game scenario. Like they're breaking out loops and like USB microscopes and being like, I found a ding on this one card. It does not matter. That is an exaggeration, but the infraction only applies to cards in a player's draw deck during a game. Cards not in the deck are not considered marked until they are put into the deck. So cards in the sideboard are not considered marked. If you do see somebody has warped cards or damaged sleeves in their sideboard, or more frequently, their main deck is dirty and damaged sleeves that have that like ripple at the top or baconing or whatever people call it, and the sideboard is all new because those cards don't get shuffled as often, you can tell the player, hey, currently you don't have marked cards because the deck you presented does not have marked cards in it. However, if you sideboard anything in, those cards will become marked. So if you side anything in, you need to unsleeve them and sleeve them in main deck sleeves. My recommendation is to just get rid of your sideboard sleeves entirely right now so that you don't run into this issue later on. This one, prevents the player from playing with marked cards, and 2, prevents you from having to give out a warning later on for them playing with marked cards. So you can be preventative in that way. Super Rider O says, this is why I tell my players to get new sleeves before any major event. Absolutely. Unfortunately, I was at an event, I guess a month ago now. Ooh, I've been at home for like a couple straight weekends, and it's wild. Anyways, I was at an event week before Thanksgiving in the United States, so I guess 3 or 4 weeks ago. And as pairings for round 1 are being announced, 2 players come up and they're like, hey, do you mind checking my deck for marked cards? I just bought new sleeves. I just re-sleeved, and I think there might be some issues. And just due to like print run inconsistencies, both players' sleeves were unfortunately marked immediately. And so while players are getting seated for round one and the head judge is starting their opening announcements, I'm helping these two players unsleeve their decks and sideboards and re-sleeve them because they got brand new sleeves, but they came out of the pack scuffed and marked, which was very unfortunate for them. But then they got sleeves, and I think both proceeded to do pretty well in the event. They are both experienced players, which is how they were able to identify the problem before anything started. Super Rider O says foils could be considered marked if they pringled. Yes. If a card is deformed or warped or pringled, it can be considered marked. However, if all cards have the same markings or wear, they're not considered marked. So, for example, if every single card in a player's deck is a Pringle and if every single card is curved like this to the point where it is so obvious that they're warped, that's fine as long as every single card is marked the same because you can't identify them. Similarly, if every single card has the warping or rippling at the top of the sleeve, or every single one has, like, some people, they flick cards in their hands, and so the corners of their sleeves get bent. If every single card has that same bend, that's not a problem. Super Rider O, you'll also notice that, like, more and more competitive players are playing fewer and fewer foils, or they're playing all foils, or they're just being very attentive to what is foil and the condition of their foils. When the game first came out, a lot of people were like, oh, I'm going to play whatever shiny cards I own because they're shiny and cool and I like them. And then players started to get marked cards penalties because some number of their cards were warped. Players should replace sleeves or cards so that they are unmarked. If the cards have become marked or damaged over the course of the event, the head judge may create proxies for those cards. This generally only happens when there is extreme damage. Somebody being like, hey, my foils were unmarked before I showed up at the event, but now they're all warped. I'm going to have difficulty buying that unless somebody came to me at the beginning of the event and they're like, hey, I have a bunch of foils. Can you check them? I look at them. They're fine. And then they come back to me 3 rounds later and are like, hey, my foils are no longer fine because the humidity in here or the dryness in here has caused them to warp. Issuing proxies is exceptionally limited. Players have 10 minutes to find replacements. So we have 2 upgrades here. One is the cards are marked and the player's unable to find appropriate replacements. So I have 5 foils that are all warped, and I cannot find replacements. However, we do have a fix for it, which is the aforementioned missing cards fix, which we covered in the deck error above. Because we are changing the deck list, we need to issue a game loss. Anytime we edit the deck list, unless it is undoing a revision, we issue a game loss. So if players unable to find replacements, we issue a game loss, change the deck list. Pulling cards from the sideboard. If the other upgrade is if the head judge believes the owner who noticed a pattern could gain a substantial advantage. Note the word here, substantial. The penalty is a game loss. If the player is doing so intentionally, we investigate for cheating. So a frequent one here is all of my Avengers are foil. Therefore, like, those are the only 3 cards that are warped. Note that if I have 3 foils in my deck, they're all Avenger, but they are not warped. That is not a problem. All of the cards being foil is not a problem. If I misspeak and say cards are foil, so they're marked, that's me misspeaking. It is if the cards are warped because they're foil. That is the problem. And so if all three of my Avengers are warped, and none the other cards in my deck are warped, I could gain a substantial advantage because I can point at the top card of my deck and say, I know what that card is, or I know that card is not an Avenger. That is a significant advantage. Similarly, classes of information. So we have potential patterns, including all sideboard cards marked in the same way, or only early plays, or cards that act as direct removal. All cards in a playset share markings. These are all possibilities. Note that the existence of a pattern does not conclusively indicate cheating. We put a lot of notes in here for like, hey, this isn't automatically cheating. I think a lot of people go from I saw an error to this is automatically cheating because I can't think of how this isn't. It is important to investigate and determine that the player knew what they did was wrong, was taking advantage of it on purpose. Alrighty. Section 4.5, slow play. Slow play, ooh. DeCaniel says, do you have guidelines if only one card is marked? Is it a pattern, philosophically speaking? This is one of those questions like, is it a deck error or a deck list error that I did not include in policy because it is a headache. Yeah, at least we don't have a GIF coming out of this one. Maybe we do. I'm not paying attention. But my personal philosophy, generally speaking, is one that runs counter to the philosophy of, not counter, but not in line with that of a lot of experienced judges, which is one card can be a pattern. The idea here is if I can point to the top card of my deck and tell you what it is or what class of card it is, if I can point to the top card of my deck and say, that's a removal event, or that's an early play unit, or that's a sideboard card, that is a problem and a player could gain a substantial advantage. So generally speaking, and particularly in Star Wars Unlimited where every card is gas, knowing that card is on top of your deck can provide some information. And so I think that one card is a pattern. And so having one marked card is a pattern. However, there you have to then ask the question of, does a player knowing that this card is on top of their deck indicate a substantial advantage? Let's, for example, look at Bosk 2 Blue. So unitless control. If the one card that is marked is like an event that acts as removal, being marked in that deck is not substantial information because every single card in that deck is a removal event, and so it doesn't tell you much to be like, oh, the card on top of my deck is a removal event. Now, it being Vigilance as opposed to take down or make an opening or something more generic is potentially more concerning. You have to consider it within the context of the event. In some decks, having that one resupply, as Swoop Plan B says, is significant. Knowing where that is significant. In other decks, it's a nice to have, but doesn't make or break the deck. Similarly, like what is substantial? Like if you're looking at a limited list, if it's some like common that is card number 29 or 30 that you added to the deck, that's not a substantial advantage. Whereas like the bomb rare or bomb legendary that is like wins you the game on the spot, that's a substantial advantage. And so one card can be a pattern. You have to identify not only is it a pattern, but if it provides substantial advantage. So yeah, one card is a pattern, but does not necessitate substantial advantage. So this probably doesn't go into the official document. It goes into the lesson. Um, Alrighty. Slow play. Slow play is an issue that arises when someone takes forever on something. I'm never guilty of going on a tangent, either in my mind or while playing. I just want to note that the last time I looked at the clock, it was 1:40, and now it's 2:40, and I don't know when that happened. Probably sometime in the last hour. Anyway, players are expected to play at a pace that will not put their opponent at a disadvantage because of the time limit. There's a fine line between slow play, unintentional, and stalling, which is intentional, a form of cheating. Players should communicate if they believe their opponent is playing too slowly. Just being like, hey, can you pick up your pace of play? Players can just ask their opponent to go faster. They can also call a judge and ask their opponent to go faster. An occasional longer turn or round is not slow play, but if a player is consistently taking longer to make decisions, especially when there are few legal actions they can take, that is considered slow play. If we are issuing a warning or a game loss, enough time has been taken away from the match that we need to remedy this. Adding more time doesn't remedy the situation because the error at hand is one player takes an unfair amount of time. And so saying you have 5 extra minutes when I take 80% of the seconds means that I get 4 minutes and you get 1 minute, which doesn't address this discrepancy. Also, it is very difficult to say, it is difficult to be like, okay, this is exactly how much time your slow play, we expect you to take about this much time, you've taken this much time, therefore we're going to give you a random time extension to meet the two in the middle. Adding an additional round of play also is a little arbitrary, but it ensures that both players get an equal amount of time because it is broken down into actions and turns, not into minutes and seconds. This section could use a little bit of revision and improvement. There was a conversation in the December 9th thread talking about the examples. You'll note that all of these examples, other than D, A and D are in-game examples, but B, C, and E are out-of-game examples. And I want to expand this a little bit with some more examples of what makes slow play slow play. So there are some suggested examples here that you can highlighted that you can read for a second if you want to read them. But I think slow play essentially isn't going to be changed, but we might just add a couple of examples and expand the definition philosophy a little bit better. Something that has been talked about is how we don't have a concrete amount of time players are allowed to take an action. If we said players are allowed to take 15 seconds per action, or even an average of 15 seconds per action, we're gonna play a little game here, and it's gonna involve me not talking for a change, which is gonna be great. I'm gonna pull up my little clock here, and we're gonna see what 15 seconds really feels like. So I'm gonna hit start, and then we're gonna be silent for 15 seconds. I'm gonna drink some water, but we begin. I'll play this card. Now we're going to wait for 15 seconds for me to resolve the trigger because that's a new decision that I have to make. I'm going to resolve the trigger in this way. Okay, now I'm going to do a third thing. So I don't know how boring that was for you. I was worried that I'm sure at the end of the broadcast I'm going to see like a drop in viewers at this point in time. I don't think so because there aren't too many of you, and you've already been here for probably 10 or 11 hours of me talking to begin with. But Sweetie B says slow play check. Tell them they have 15 seconds per action. Then if they intentionally take 15 seconds every action, issue the slow play warning. The challenge there is if policy says you're allowed to take 15 actions and they are within the lines of rules or policy, they're not actually breaking a rule. Hedkin says, I like the Klaus Tuber solution of chanting, take your turn or I will hit you. So we do want to avoid, we're going to scroll down real fast. Aggressive behavior. A player or judge makes threats or takes threatening actions towards another player or makes any event participants feel threatened. So that's not a great solution, given that if you do that, we'll disqualify you. But hey, make a play, I'm getting bored here, or I'm going to fall asleep, is something you can say. Marthorlax says, this timing is why I play Mana Mana's refrain in my head when I'm watching for slow play. I am uncultured and do not know what that refrain is. I would like to know what that refrain is. But giving them putting a precise time in policy makes it exploitable. And the amount of time a player can take on a decision definitely changes depending on where you are in the game. A lot of decisions generally can be done relatively quickly, and deciding what is a new decision can be difficult. If you play a unit with ambush, is it one decision to play and resolve the ambush? What about something that has an ambush and a when played, like Vader? If we've identified things that have when played, like ambush or like Rebel Fleet Lieutenant, which has when played attack with unit, right, as same decision as playing the card, then do other when playeds count as the same decision? Do I have 15 seconds to decide to resolve Vader and his ambush and his search effect, or do I have 45 seconds? Or do I have 30 seconds because the play and ambush is one and resolving the trigger is another? It's really hard to quantify that sort of stuff. And so we avoid that, but by just saying it is your judgment. Putting, honestly, like 5 or 10 seconds for most decisions, and like being able to resolve a turn in 15 seconds, maybe 20 for something with nested actions and modified abilities, but people can play relatively quickly. But yeah, slow play is just if you feel like they're slow. It is a judgment call, and we're going to talk about it in a little, like the detail that I've talked here will also show up in the lesson, which is more than the policy document can go into. Because if we go into too much detail, it becomes something that can be abused. Because something like, so gameplay disruptions are a lot harder to abuse. Because there are hard and fast rules. Whereas slow play is just something that, like, you have to always pay the correct resource. We're not going to say every action is exactly 5 seconds, and if you go fast, we're going to hold you and give your opponent time to think during those 5 seconds or 10 seconds or whatever, right? It is always going to be dynamic and changing. And so policy is built around the idea that it is dynamic and changing rather than trying to have a one-size-fits-all answer. All right, outside assistance. Player requests outside assistance from a spectator, or a spectator provides unsolicited outside assistance during a match, draft, or deck construction. Players may not consult notes they made before they presented their deck to their opponent during a match. This is just a reminder of notes policy, and consulting notes is this should be clearer that notes is outside assistance. I think it is relatively clear, but I want to just make it a little bit more explicit. But once you have that outside assistance, once somebody says, have you considered this card, or don't forget your trigger, or triggers, if they point out an optional trigger, that's a problem. If they point out something mandatory, we should have a note here about pointing out a mandatory error. So if a player points out a gameplay disruption of any sort that the opponent would be required to point out, so anything other than an optional trigger, if they point out incorrect shuffling, inaccurate mandatory ability, an open card manipulation error, hidden card manipulation error, anything along those lines, that is not outside assistance. And that needs to be clarified in this section. They shouldn't be doing that. Players or spectators should not be calling out errors in other matches. They should be saying, judge, I see an error, or players, I see an error, I'm going to call for a judge, and then call for a judge. They should not be saying, hey, you forgot to defeat that. That should be defeated. You should resolve that trigger. Because those are things that need to happen, and we don't want to penalize players for making the game state legal incorrect. However, since it dances on a line of some things you don't need to point out, such as optional triggers, it is a best practice for players to not point things out, because that might result in them getting outside assistance. DeCaniel says, do you consider, quote, you should concede, unquote, at the start or end of the match by a friend outside assistance? Had some debate because I think intuitively OA is about strategic advice, not tournament advice, but it can still modify the result of a match. I think that once a match has sat, somebody telling you to concede or draw does constitute advice. Or it also possibly begins to fall under collusion. It's definitely not something that we want in our events. We don't want players telling other players how to play their matches at Now, notably, if you have not yet sat for your match and somebody says you should concede, that's not outside assistance. Or like, it's best if you concede because here's the tournament math. But once you've sat, you are making that decision yourself. So I'm going to add a note about how I think that should be added to our examples or a description. Alrighty. Communication policy error. This one's a fun one. Player breaks communication policy laid out in Section 7 of the tournament regulations, and their opponent makes a decision based on that information. This only applies to errors in communication detailed in policy, not general communication. So we're going to go back up all the way up to Section 7. So this is primarily what, honestly, I think it might be refined to just Section 7.1 because these other areas don't lead to communication errors. The only thing that you can have an error about is status, open, game, and hidden information. So if a player if I tell you that I have 27 damage on my base, but I actually have 25, and you attack with a 3-power unit, and then I'm like, oh crap, I was at 25, I only go to 28. That is a communication policy error because I have incorrectly communicated the amount of damage on my base, and you've made a decision based on the amount of damage on my base. If you incorrectly tell me how many counters you have on a card and make a decision based on that, that's a communication policy error. If you essentially provide any of this information incorrectly, so status, open, or game information, you cannot cause communication policy error with hidden information because your opponent doesn't get to know any of it. And so you're allowed to bluff about hidden information, and so it is okay to miscommunicate about it. But if you make an error with section 7.1.1.2 or .3, that falls into communication policy errors. However, miscommunicating in that way does not guarantee that a communication policy error has occurred. If no decision was made based on the information, no remedy is applied. If we're called, the player gets a tracking penalty. If we're not called, we can ignore it. So if I say I have 3 damage on my Obi-Wan, or Obi-Wan has 5 remaining HP, and then I pass to you, and before you attack, I'm like, sorry, Obi-Wan has 6 remaining HP. I didn't include the +1 experience from the experience counter, the +1 from this other effect. The opponent has not yet made a decision or a non-decision based on that information, and therefore communication policy error has not. We can issue a tracking penalty, but honestly, we're not going to get called for it. So this is just a make the opponent feel good about it penalty rather than we actually resolve anything. We only care about the decision made based on the erroneous communication. So if, for example, you ask me how many cards I have in my hand, I tell you 4, you say, okay, cool. Well, I don't have anything else this round. I'm going to claim the initiative. And you don't have any resources, you don't have any units, you don't have any cards in hand. Then we pass, we go through, regroup. I draw 2 cards, you draw 2 cards. You say, hey, how many cards do you have in your hand again? And I'm like, oh, sorry, when I said 4, I should have said 5. I have 7 in my hand now. Since you didn't make any decision, we don't back up. If I go, okay, Spark of Rebellion you to take you from 6 cards down to 5 cards, and you're like, sorry, I'm at 7 cards and you're bringing me down to 6. We only undo the Spark of Rebellion. We don't go all the way back to the communication, because going back to the point of communication, 1, is often harder than going back to the point of error, and 2, we don't need to go that far back. We can correct the information by telling the player the correct information now, and then undoing the errors or undoing the game actions that were taken because of that incorrect information. Notably, if somebody chooses to, for example, in example A, a player is asked how many cards they have in hand, answers 3. When their opponent plays Spark of Rebellion, they realize they have 4. This is communication policy error. We undo the Spark of Rebellion if the player wants to undo the Spark of Rebellion. However, if the player's like, oh, you have 3 cards, I don't want to spark you, I'm just going to play something that says player discards 3 cards, or I'm just going to attack with a unit to draw a card, and they don't realize, like, the information, they chose an action that is unrelated, but they would have chosen a different action with the correct information. So essentially a non-action. A non-action is considered an action here. So if I choose to do something or not do something because of the erroneous information, we rewind to that point where the decision was made. JJ Hoovian asks, what about non-active player who now has the beneficial info about Spark of Rebellion? So that player received the warning for communication policy error. The vast majority of the time, this is unintentional. One of the challenges with rewinding games is that players do gain an advantage of knowledge of what their opponent has. But the player does get a warning because they provided incorrect information. Their opponent took an action based on it. And if it repeats, like all other event disruptions, a second or subsequent warning for communication policy error upgrades to a game loss. They will play the game with that additional knowledge. We do not have the Men in Black pen to remove that knowledge from their head. But our options here are communication policy error is straight game loss. If opponent made a decision based on erroneous information. We have what it currently is warning upgrading to a game loss if it's a second time. Or we could have is a warning, but we don't rewind. And we just force the players to continue to play on with the decisions that they've already made. That way the player who communicated information incorrectly is like they don't gain knowledge of what their opponent's going to do because that action is locked in. If you're saying like you say, or active player says I have 3 cards in hand, non-active player says okay, then they play Spark of Rebellion, active player realizes that they have 4 cards as they reveal their hand, and then non-active player is like, wait a second, now that I know that you have 4 cards in hand and not 3, I don't want to play Spark of Rebellion. That does still fall under communication policy error. The player who played Spark of Rebellion is gaining significant information here because now they know what's in their opponent's hand. But they would not have had the opportunity to undo the Spark if their opponent had not been incorrect in providing information. If the player had just said 4 correctly, then the player is locked into Spark. And so the window of a player seeking out a communication policy error by being like, how many cards do you have in your hand? Okay, I'm going to make a play based on that communication that I know is erroneous and then call for a judge as soon as that information is revealed. So I'm going to get to know what's in your hand and take back my Spark. That's feels somewhat contrived and unlikely to happen because the inciting factor is the player who is being disadvantaged making an error. And notably, this is something that we talked about for, 5 or 10 minutes in the previous 6-hour-long section, which I have no idea where in that 6-hour video it is. Probably somewhere in the middle when I'm talking about gameplay disruptions. But as soon as we are considering a rewind of any sort, we are almost never going back to a purely natural game state because one or both players now know what their opponent would do in a particular game state at minimum. Even if no cards were revealed, even if the rewind is, oh, then I don't attack with this unit, the opponent now knows you don't have anything better than attack with this unit in that game state. And so if we get there, or if it is make an unfavorable trade into an opponent's unit, and the error was about how much damage was on it, and so with the new information, it isn't actually a trade anymore, it's just throwing your own unit away. Your opponent still now knows that you don't have, say, a removal event that cleanly deals with it better than the attack. And so some information has been gained that high-level players will be able to take advantage of, but locking players into an erroneous game state is generally more damaging than an erroneous game state and that information is gained, because that information has still been gained, right? The player, when I make that bad attack or I play Spark, that player is going to have that information regardless of whether or not we fix the situation. And then if we're worried about an advantage being gained from it, you can only gain this advantage during the tournament once, because if you try to gain advantage in this convoluted way, which again is dependent on your opponent making an error, it just doesn't happen. Alrighty. Limited procedure disruption. Player commits an error during draft or sealed pool registration. Errors in draft and sealed pool registration procedures can be disruptive and can have significant consequences if not handled promptly. Player improperly marking cards during card pool registration or during deck construction is not a limited procedure disruption as long as it's caught before the end of deck construction. I want to add a little sentence here. As long as it can be verified. What section are we in? Section 4.8. So, as long as it's caught before the end of deck construction, and as long as you can confirm the error with the player who registered the pool and opened the cards. So if I open my packs, hand them to you, and you register things incorrectly, and you're like, Judge, I should have marked this instead of this. You ask the person who opened the packs, did you in fact open this? Did you? You really only need to do this for, rares and legendaries. You don't really need to worry too much about commons. If they're like, hey, I accidentally put a 2 here instead of a 2 here, it's down 1 row, you just bump that up. Similarly, if I hand my registered pool back to you, you finish, you're doing deck construction, you're like, hold on, you registered that I have 2 of these, it should be actually 2 of these. Again, we can just fix that now. This is generally going to be 2 card pools get mixed together, or a player passes their picks during a draft, or something like that. There is no set fix for limited procedure disruptions because they are so infrequent and so damaging. You should just get the head judge involved. If cards have gone missing during a draft, you need to get the head judge involved, and often you need to get the TO involved, because sometimes the fix for a limited procedure error or disruption is get that player 3 new packs or 6 new packs and just start their process over from scratch. However, that is not a decision that the head judge gets to make. That is the decision that the tournament organizer gets to make, because it costs them money. Anything that costs the tournament money is essentially a decision that the tournament organizer gets to make. You, as the head judge, unless you are particularly given permission by the TO, don't get to solve problems by throwing booster packs at them. And if you cannot be the situation cannot be corrected, game loss should be issued, applied to the player's next game or match. This is I don't love having a game loss here, but it is essentially hey, you have made things so bad that we can't fix it, and there needs to be some amount. This is another. It's not going to happen again in this tournament, so it's not you do this twice, warning game loss. This isn't going to happen again in a tournament. If a player passes packs in the wrong direction during a draft, or mixes their sealed pool with another set of cards, that's not going to happen a second time in a single event unless the player's doing it intentionally. And so for this infraction to have any teeth, it needs to be a game loss. Alrighty. Insufficient shuffling or insufficient randomization. Player needs to properly randomize their deck or set of cards. Set of cards is considered not shuffled if the judge believes a player could reasonably know the position of one or more cards in the deck or set of cards. If a player is search the top 3 cards of your deck, put 1 into your hand, the other 2 on the bottom of your deck, shuffling 2 cards is really hard to do. But just do the best you can. This is really mostly a call out for somebody who just pile counts and calls that randomization. Something that will happen is a lot of players have habits that are not good with regard to randomization. For example, they take their early plays and place them every like 5 cards throughout the deck, or like they take all of the resupplies that are clumped up in their resources next to each other and shuffles puts one at the top, one in the middle, one at the bottom of their deck. One of two things happens here. Either them putting these cards in specific places in the deck after they finish shuffling does not have any impact on the order those cards are in their deck. If they shuffled appropriately, it is as likely that those cards end up next to each other as they end up in the places where they started. This is not allowed. Like, if it has no impact, it is just a waste of time. And if it does have an impact, it is stacking your deck and not allowed. However, this sort of weaving, I'm not going to call it stacking because that feels like it has more intention. But this sort of intentional bad randomization is not necessarily cheating. As Hedkin says, it's because people cannot intuit true random. And so if somebody's doing it and it doesn't seem to have an impact on, you should generally tell them to stop. And the explanation I give is either it is doing something and you're not allowed to. You can get most players be like, hey, would you allow a player to pick the top 6 cards of their deck before a game starts? And they're going to say no. And you're like, okay, so would you allow a player to choose the spread of early game cards to late game cards in their deck? Also, no. Most players would agree that these things are bad. And so you can say, okay, so if your thing does impact how your deck is randomized, if you are impacting the random, you can agree that that's not random, and a not random deck is not allowed. And they're like, yes. And you're like, okay, cool. However, if you are shuffling your deck properly, which it looks like you are, what you're doing is just wasting everybody's time. Now, if it's 2 seconds of at the end of the game, they go resource, and then shuffle, or grab their 3 Avengers and spread them out and go Avenger, and then shuffle, and it takes a second, that's not a problem. You don't need to give them this long talk. It's just going to make them be like, you're acting like a parent now, telling me to not do things that I really don't care about. But my brain just stopped working for a second. If they're spending a significant amount of time pile counting, and they're doing this every time they shuffle, tell them to not. Pile counting can be done. Players should not pile count to randomize. Players can pile count to count their deck. Doing it once per game is okay, just to make sure you've sideboarded correctly or de-sideboarded correctly. Once per match also works, but then if you sideboard, you just want to make sure that you have the correct number of cards. So once per game is fine. Generally, players aren't going to be shuffling that often, though, particularly in Star Wars Unlimited. If we failed to randomize cards, the way we fixed it is by randomizing the cards. Relatively straightforward. Super Rider O says at least we don't have to worry about mana weaving in this game. Yes, we don't have to worry about that explicitly, but making sure that you have a good spread of 2-3 drops, 4-6 drops, 7+ drops, and spreading those throughout your deck. That's something that somebody might do just to ensure that any cross section they draw is, I'm never more than a draw step away from either an early turn play or a late game play. And so every draw step throughout the entire match is going to give me something useful. That is something that we could be potentially concerned about. Alrighty. Before we get to unsporting conduct. I'm going to take a quick break because I've been talking for 2 hours. If anybody has any questions about anything we've discussed today, so that's going to be gameplay disruption sections 3 through 7, 8. I should know this. 7, yeah. So 3.4 through 3.7, or event disruptions 4.1 to 4.9. Throw them in chat now. And when I come back in about 2 minutes, we're going to dive into unsporting conduct and the last 10 pages of this overview. I'm so excited. All right, I'll be right back. Alrighty, and we're back. Uh, so let's talk about this. Headkin says Jonah's gone quick, come up with a convoluted question that likely won't happen. You don't need to try to do that. You just do that all the time by your nature. Alrighty. Daniel has a question about deck error, and then Starkiller has discussing a call. All right, we'll get into the USC question when we get into USC question. Let's go back to deck error. So, Daniel asks, I missed a downgrade judges asked about deck error. We are in the start of the event in Constructed, and we see wrong deck boxes, i.e. another deck is available. Is a downgrade plus explanation warranted? I personally like the approach of that judge to prevent before the point of usual abuse, i.e. sideboard, but doesn't say from I know this person, what they play, and I'll make swaps on the fly. I am not sure. I understand. Oh, so you're saying like you're at the start of an event and you see a player with one of the deck boxes that holds two decks in it. I would absolutely be proactive and just be like, hey, having this deck box can lead you to deck errors, which results in game losses. Present your sideboard. Please avoid this. I know at some events we've even made announcements because so many players were playing with deck pods that had multiple decks in them. And I know this person, what they play, and I'll make swaps on the fly. If that's a real concern, that player can, like, that is a level of premeditated cheating where they can do that in a standard, like, they can still do those cheats even if we don't tell them how to avoid getting the game loss for having extra cards in their deck box. Because if they do those cheats and we do deck check them, we're going to find that their deck is different, and then we're going to have some serious questions for them. So I'm not terribly concerned unless I am missing the question, because it seemed a little convoluted, like Headkin requested. But let's dive in. Please feel free to clarify. Let me know if I was on point or off. Otherwise, we're going to just dive into unsporting conduct. So, goal of Star Wars Unlimited Organized Play is to promote a safe, welcoming environment for players of all kinds to come and enjoy the games they love. Inappropriate behavior, even minor instances, can lower, even ruin attendees' enjoyment. All attendees are held to the expectation that they treat every person around them with politeness, respect, and general courtesy. Those who violate this expectation risk being deemed unwelcome at the event, and at the tournament organizer's discretion may be removed from the premises. Repeat offenders may be suspended from attending official FFG OP events at FFG's discretion. While exceptionally technical play or rule sharking may not be considered sporting conduct, it is also not capital U, capital C, unsporting conduct. This should be exceptionally. I have opinions about how words should be. And you can see how good I type. Alrighty. Minor unsporting conduct, inappropriate behavior. Behavior that results in somebody feeling uncomfortable. The examples do not list all possibilities of inappropriate behavior. It is up to a judge's discretion to be like, hey, that's not allowed at this event. Just, there's a line between, hey, that's not cool, cut it out, and, hey, that is absolutely inappropriate. You cannot be doing that here. I'm going to issue a warning. It's also possible for somebody to unintentionally commit any or most of these behavioral unsporting conducts. Somebody might be making a joke that they think is funny and they don't understand. is not funny. A large portion of the TCG community are people who have uh, different understandings of social dynamics, and consequently, there are a lot of people who don't understand where the correct lines are. However, just because somebody has not received that education or does not understand why the line is there doesn't mean they haven't crossed the line. And so even if you have somebody who just regularly does not seem to grasp what appropriate and inappropriate behavior is, that does not mean that they should not be getting unsporting conduct. Notably, USC Minor is probably in contention with slow play for the most underissued infraction. Because slow play is you as a judge saying, subjectively, I think that you're playing the game slowly. And therefore, really you're just bad at this. If you were good, you'd play faster. That's my opinion. And that's really hard to tell a player because of the social pressure coming back from the player, and the judgment involved because it is subjective. Similarly, unsporting conduct is you saying to a person, hey, I think you're not being a good person right now. And doing that is so hard, especially because a lot of the time when an unsporting conduct infraction is warranted, that player is already upset about something else, right? Like they don't like a ruling. They think that the reversing decisions call you made is insane, or they don't like the fact that they got a game loss because they were tardy, and they are mad already. And giving them another penalty or giving them a penalty for like their opponent's error or something along those lines, that only throws gas onto the fire and doesn't diffuse the situation. But we do have a note that if infraction occurs on stream or recorded match, penalty is upgraded. Anything that happens on stream, like because of the visibility of stream, unsporting conduct infractions that occur on stream are upgraded a tier essentially. And that should also occur to insulting behavior, and I mean maybe harassment as well. Just because the stream is representative of the game in a much broader way. So, as we said, I'm going to copy this and say that it needs to be in all USCs. All behavioral USCs. Alrighty. Note that unlike we go from warning to match loss, warning to match loss. And if we get to a third, player is just removed from the event. Because players cannot behave inappropriately at events. That it's just not allowed. And this generally isn't the sort of thing that is wholly unconscious. You did decide to make that joke, or you did decide to make that comment. These are all things that a player is actively doing, not passively doing. So, player inappropriately demands that a floor judge issue a penalty to their opponent. This one's weird. We have both the word inappropriately and demands. If a player's like, hey, I think my opponent should get a game loss because whatever, that isn't a demand. If you're like, nope, not a game loss, and they're like, okay, that's fine. I was misremembering, or I come from another game where I think it's a game loss. If they request or suggest, that's fine. Also, if like a player does do something where a player should get a game loss, and you're like, I'm going to give you a warning for deck list error. And the opponent's like, that should be a game loss. That absolutely should be a game loss. Policy says that that's a game loss. that's not inappropriately demanding that a floor judge issue a penalty to their opponent. That is appropriately telling the judge that they're wrong. Now, is this politely appealing? No. But you need to meet both inappropriately and demanding. But going back to Starkiller 07700, what is the line on discussing a judge call from the head judge to arguing the call? When does arguing become unsporting conduct? So it essentially becomes a problem when the judge says it's a problem. So we have here example B, a player appeals a ruling before a floor judge finishes issuing a ruling. If I go, hey, you're going to be getting a warning for inaccurate mandatory ability, and the player's like, I would like to appeal, I have issued my ruling. The penalty and the infraction are the relevant parts of the ruling. Even if we haven't gotten through the remedy, we don't need to get through the entire remedy. However, somebody being like, hey, are you sure? Like if I say, okay, so you have committed, and they're like, I would like to appeal, and you're like, okay, I haven't finished saying any words yet. I haven't made a ruling for you to appeal yet. That's unsporting conduct territory. But you don't have to finish enacting your ruling. You don't have to say, here's the infraction, here's the penalty, here's the remedy, let's complete the remedy. Okay, now you can appeal. It's as soon as you get the infraction and penalty out there, heck, even if it's just like the infraction, if you're like, hey, this is a deck error, the player's like, I don't believe this is a deck error, I'd like to appeal that. That's okay. As soon as like the infraction's out there, they should try to be polite and try not to interrupt you, but a lot of players are going to be fast on the trigger with penalties, particularly if it's a game loss or something along those lines. But Starkiller's question about what is the line on discussing a judge call from head judge to arguing with it. At a certain point, so I like having conversations with players. When a player is not content with a call and they don't like the answer, whether they disagree with the rules or they disagree with the policy, I'm like, okay, let's talk about what you don't like. And at a certain point, I determine we are going in circles and nothing I can say can explain this to this player in a way that will leave them satisfied in a timely manner. This conversation needs to end now. And at that point, I say, okay, I have tried to explain to you a couple different ways now. You still seem to be not content with this call. I recognize that. However, this is my ruling, and my ruling is final. I do need you to continue playing your match. Please feel free to come find me between matches, and we can continue to have this conversation. If they're like, I want to keep on fighting after I've been told to continue playing my match, at that point, we are in unsporting conduct territory. If you're like, okay, if the player's like, okay, I have one concern that I didn't express yet or that you didn't address yet, I'd probably allow them a concern. And if they're like, okay, this, and you're like, I've already addressed that, or I believe I've already addressed that, go back to your match. You are in charge of that conversation, and you get to decide when too much time is too much time and when it becomes discussing and arguing. If a player's attitude to you shifts and you're like, this is no longer appropriate, that's a problem. All right. DeCaniel says, I'll be honest that C and E make me a bit worried for the associated upgrades, especially E. So C is... This isn't like a player leaves like a broken sleeve or a scrap of notebook paper at a table. This is a player opens a box and leaves every single wrapper and the box on the table, and makes it so that like it takes time to clean up and is disruptive to the event. Note that like these also have to be disruptive to the event. If a player opens a box or like leaves their lunch at table 7,468, and there's no event there, that's not disruptive to the event. Players are allowed to be gremlins and monsters and leave trash everywhere where there isn't an event. But if they leave like if in between rounds 6 and 7 a player just eats lunch at table 1 and then just leaves their garbage there, that's a problem and disruptive, because now the players playing at table 1 have to clear that out or call a judge to clear it out, or if it's like a pile of pack wrappers. The challenge with example C is most of the time it's not identifiable garbage because it's just garbage, and so you don't know who it belongs to. This is here so that if somebody is leaving excessive trash, you can be like, hey, clean that up. And have something in policy to be like, hey, part of what you're doing is acceptable. E is another reasonable one. I think that the feature match area is significant and exceptional. And what is like, it is a very vague line because what's appropriate changes. Like, winning your game to get into top 8 of the Galactic Championship is different than winning game 1 of weekly play or like a store showdown, right? Rushing off stage to like tackle one of your friends who like also made top 8 to celebrate with them, like that is appropriate. And again, it does have to be disruptive to the event, and very often like the feature match area is separated from the rest of the event. But you don't want a player who's at like table 5 with ongoing matches to either side of them to like jump up, hit the table, knock cards around, and start screaming and beating their chest while like shaking their fists at the sky. That's disruptive. But like a loud outburst of like hooray, that's not a problem. It is definitely open to cultural interpretation, but I think what is disruptive does change from one part of the world to another. And so if I was like, okay, this is an acceptable volume for players to be at, and then we move from an American event to, say, an event in Japan, I think if we set policy to be what is acceptable in America for levels of volume and celebration, that's going to be a problem in most of the rest of the world. And so it does need to be culturally interpreted and independent of what is like, some things we can just say are not appropriate. For example, these A and B are generically not appropriate. F, generically not appropriate. E and D, those are culturally divergent. And allowing for different expressions of culture is a feature, not a bug. Because there is not yet a monoculture in this world. Alrighty. Unsporting conduct, insulting behavior. This is targeted or direct language. This is the part where I stop having examples that I can say on Twitch. If somebody... I can say... If I'm like, hey, you're stupid, or wow, you're an idiot, I can't believe you made it this far in the event, I don't understand how you're undefeated, that's insulting behavior. That is a step beyond inappropriate behavior. And at that point, we're in game loss land. Similarly, for cultural interpretation, what is vulgar or profane language differs. Um, what might be okay in the UK or Australia might not fly in the conservative South in the United States, um, might not fly in Canada, where they are known for their politeness. But this is the thing about inappropriate behavior. It is generally untargeted, right? It is just being loud, being messy, that sort of thing. Even example F is you have something inappropriate, but it is not targeted towards anybody. It is just potentially problematic. Hedkin says, you clearly haven't been to Alberta. I have been to Alberta. I even know that they don't have rats in Alberta. Alberta, from my understanding, is the Texas of Canada, so it's a little different. But insulting behavior is targeted, like calling Alberta the Texas of Canada. That's a problem. It does not need to be a vulgar insult. It just needs to be a targeted insult. Also, something to keep in mind with all of the unsporting conducts, but particularly inappropriate behavior and insulting behavior, is sometimes there will be banter that could cross the line into an inappropriate or insulting behavior, right? And you have to determine, if I am chatting with my friend after they lost a match, I'm like, I can't believe you're undefeated. You're such a garbage player, friend. How are you undefeated? You're playing a stupid deck. You're a stupid player. What are you doing? That's not insulting behavior. If the vibe is right, and that is something that you're going to have to evaluate personally. However, it is possible that it is inappropriate behavior, because even though it wasn't actually insulting, the person who it was targeted towards was not insulted by it. Because if they're like, yeah, I literally don't know, this deck was a meme, I am apparently the best player in the world, what is happening? All I do is make misplays and I keep on winning. I don't know what's happening here either. If the player's not insulted, it can still be inappropriate behavior because it's not behavior that we want to encourage. And if somebody overheard that commentary, they might feel uncomfortable. So you can go in and be like, hey, what you said is not appropriate. If the person that you were talking to was not as chill as they are, it's not it would be insulting behavior. It's not insulting behavior because the person you were targeting not insulted. However, still inappropriate. Like example F is essentially passively is inappropriate. DeCaniel says, insulting context matters. Inappropriate if bystanders are or could be offended, then context is not valid. I'm not going to say context is not valid, but inappropriate is a much lower threshold and does not need to be targeted. Even if I'm trying to like gas up my friend and it's like, I'm not going to say the things that'll get me in trouble on Twitch, but if I'm throwing a lot of vulgar or foul language into me gassing up my friend, that's not insulting behavior. I might even be complimentary, but if I'm swearing loudly, that's like, even though my intent is purely beneficent, all I'm trying to do is make my friend feel better, that can still be inappropriate. And so you don't wholly ignore when you're talking to the player, don't ignore context of their action, but you can say, even though all you're doing is trying to make your friend feel good, what you are doing is, in addition to making your friend feel good, making other people feel uncomfortable. And that part is not acceptable. Making your friend feel good, acceptable. Making other people feel Not good, not acceptable. Um, Insulting behavior is more contextual, and inappropriate behavior is a little bit less contextual. Um, but context does still matter to a degree because, for example, if we're talking about like the victory celebration, like a victory celebration at Galactics or in the feature match area, is a contextually relevant description. Again, all of unsporting conduct, not all, most of unsporting conduct is subjective. There's a lot of subjectivity of, I think that this behavior is inappropriate, therefore inappropriate behavior. I think that somebody was insulted by this, insulting behavior. I guess the line is somebody actually has to be insulted for it to be insulting behavior. If somebody could potentially be insulted, it is inappropriate behavior, if that distinction makes sense. Also, moving on to major unsporting conduct, harassment. This is slurs, taking inappropriate photos of another person, making unwanted advances, getting in the way of somebody, misgendering, physical touch, bullying. Like, we have a bunch of examples because we want to have, because these are generally subjective, we want to have more examples than something that is more objective. For example, in inappropriate mandatory ability and illegal gameplay, we can just say you break the comprehensive rules because that is very objective. The comprehensive rules are very objective. What is harassment is not, there isn't a document that we can point to and be like, this is the document of what defines harassment that everybody agrees on. So we have a lot of, harassment is targeted and more severe than insulting. Note that there is an upgrade here where if the player fails to demonstrate remorse after the infraction or committed the infraction intentionally or repeats the behavior, infraction is upgraded to disqualification. The player should be removed from the venue. The end. This is not something that the head judge determines. This is a TO decision, but if somebody commits harassment at your event, you disqualify them and tell the TO, policy says that this person should not be allowed at the venue. If you want to welcome them back to your store later, you can do that, but policy says get them out of here. Somebody asked me off stream about why policy says should in a lot of places as opposed to must. And the metaphor that I'm really happy with is should is, this is the instruction, this is what policy is. Policy is the player needs to be removed from the venue. However, policy also has to deal with human behavior, and so there are reasons why the person might not be removed from the venue. I can't think of any off the top of my head where somebody commits harassment multiple times and there's a valid reason to not remove them from the venue. I'm sure somebody could come up with a circumstance. But the distinction between should and must is, the metaphor I used earlier with this person was, when you cross the street, you should look both ways. If you don't, you're much more likely to have a problem. And so policy here is like, this is best practice, do this every time, unless you have a very important reason to not do that. That is why we use should here instead of must. Because this entire document has a degree of subjectivity. Now, note that if the player repeats the behavior, the infraction is upgraded to a disqualification. Disqualification is not should be upgraded to a disqualification. It is upgraded to disqualification. So there are some things where we do use should because a little bit more discretion should be applied, or because the decision is out of the hands of the head judge. Headkin says, should, quote, use to indicate a strong recommendation, but not a requirement of this standard. Ignoring the recommendation could result in undesirable results. That's a very polite way of putting it. Yeah, absolutely. So, major unsporting conduct harassment, it's a match loss. If they do not feel bad about it, or if they did it on purpose and feel bad about it now, or if they repeat it, get them out of here. Disqualification. Aggressive behavior. We're going to have a couple easy ones. Aggressive behavior. A player threatens somebody or hurts somebody. Disqualify them and remove them from the venue. If somebody commits assault and battery, do not let them continue to play in your event. I'm going to skip a couple. Player commits fraud, misrepresents who they are, get them out of here. If somebody commits a crime, get them out of here. A lot of these come down to this person has done something that is just not acceptable. Get them out of here. I don't think I need to explain why aggressive behavior is not allowed. All right. Illegally determining a result. This is new. This is new to policy. A player uses or offers an artificial or random method to determine the outcome of a game or match outside of the mechanics of the game. This is a match loss. If you inappropriately determine winner, this is looking at like Daniel asks, you make a remark about the TO will do it. Are TO powers responsibilities outlined here? Example for unsporting conduct sleeves playmats. I usually ask TOs who know better the cultural conduct or context. There is way earlier in the document. Oh nope. It's before players. We didn't go far enough. Leader roles. Tournament organizer. This is tournament organizer responsibilities. The power here, the only powers here listed are deny entry to a participant or have a participant removed from the venue. It does not explicitly call out that tournament organizers are the person you should go to if you have a question about whether or not like play matter behavior is appropriate. That's more of a best practice than policy. There are many stores or many TOs where they're just like, I trust my judges to make this decision. It's not a decision I'm making. Alrighty. Back to the legally determining result. If a player looks at cards in their deck that they did not have access to during the game and is like, oh, I was going to be dead, I'll concede, when the game was going to be a draw, that is illegally determining a result. You're not allowed to have access to that information to determine a result. People are playing sealed and they're like, my deck sucks. And another person's like, my deck also sucks. Do you want to play Premier or Twin Suns or Eternal instead? Or another game? Not allowed. You got to play the decks that you registered for the event. Players like, hey, it's going to be a draw. I want to roll for it. Even if their opponent... So previously, asking was attempted collusion, and it was a disqualification if the players agreed. Here, if the players are not aware it's against the rules, it's a match loss. If players are aware it's not permitted, it's considered under unsporting conduct cheating. They did something wrong. Gain advantage. Disqualification is on the table. But needs to be investigated. This exists because we can't have players rolling dice to determine the outcome of a game. Historically, there have been concerns about card games being gambling. You might notice that like trading card games like to associate themselves more with something like chess than poker. Even though the skill is more like dealing with the variance is a skill that is more practical in other card games like poker and blackjack. But that's because trading card games want to be further away from uh, gambling. And so if we allow players to uh, reveal cards until you hit a crate dragon, or flip a coin to determine something, or roll a dice to determine something, those are random outcomes, not skill outcomes. And it starts to veer towards gambling. And based on the variety of gambling laws across the globe, publishers strive to avoid any sort of overlap with gambling. However, the most frequent individuals who commit this infraction are players who are new to the game and are just like, I don't want to draw, you don't want to draw. Random seems fair to me, and to most players, it does seem fair. But it's not something that we can allow. We'll just say, hey, you're not allowed to decide that way. There is a stern penalty with it, but the player isn't removed from the event. And so it's, look, you didn't want to have, you didn't want the game to end in a draw. Like, if we look at example A, player says, I'm going to concede. We say, no, you're not allowed to concede. Instead, you're going to get a match loss. In a lot of cases, what's happening is a new player's like, I want to determine an outcome for this match. I'm going to do something outside the bounds of rules and policy. And we say, okay, you're not allowed to do that. Let us instead give you a different artificial result. It's a match loss. However, this is a penalty because you have disrupted the integrity of the entire match. Your match is no longer is valid, and so you don't get to have that match anymore. It is possible that both players receive a match loss. If the players agree to roll dice, they roll the dice. Player says, okay, I lose. And then a spectator is like, hold on, did you just roll dice, judge? Note that if you're watching and a player begins to do one of these things, stop them. Do not let them actually commit the infraction and issue the match loss. Let them know before they commit the match loss. I had a match very recently earlier where players were live for like top 8 or top 16 or something, depending on the outcome of their match. They go to time, they finish their extra round. They are talking about like match points in the board state, which they are allowed to do. And one of the players is just thinking and then goes to pick up the top several cards of their deck and looks at them before I am able to intervene. And at that point, I'm like, hold on. I know that you're discussing if either of you wants to concede. You're not asking your opponent to concede, but you're just like, I'm thinking about maybe conceding. Opponent's like, I'm trying to evaluate the board state here. I'm also considering this situation because if we draw, neither of us gets to make the cut. And one of the players looks at the cards in their deck, and I intervene at that point because that is the point where that player is no longer allowed to choose a result. That player is no longer allowed to concede. They are still allowed to accept a concession from their opponent, and they are still allowed to let the match be a draw. But they can no longer choose to concede because they have seen information that they did not have access to during the game, which is the information that they're allowed to use to make that decision. Their opponent was very upset because they're like, I think that we should both have the opportunity to concede. Shouldn't my opponent get a game loss for looking at extra cards? And I was like, you are just trying to dig your way into something crazy here. But this is new, and it is separate from bribery, collusion, and gambling because it is unintentional and unaware, and it is mostly committed by players who do not know better. It is plausible to combine illegally determining result and bribery, collusion, and gambling. However, we would have... Oh, that's interesting. Uh, the examples for aggressive behavior are numbered. Sorry, we're in Cloud Cuckoo land. I don't know how many of these that I've caught today are Seth Hellman contributions as well, but that's a fun one. Anyways, um, if we combined illegally determining result and its 5 examples and bribery, collusion, gambling with its 6 examples, we would have 11 examples, which is far too many. And the definition would be somewhat more complex. The philosophy, like, they're just a little bit too different to have them be a single infraction. They are also very different from the perspective of the tournament organizer and the publisher, and also social consideration. A player who rolls dice is going to be treated very differently by the publisher and from tournament organizers than a player who goes to their opponent and is like, hey, if you scoop to me, I'll give you $50. Those are 2 very different things. One of them is I don't know better. One is I do know better. Essentially the difference between cheating and gameplay disruptions. And we want to make sure that there is a distinction between the 2 of them. So, bribery, collusion, gambling. Player bribes their opponent. Collusion is where the players discuss an outcome other than choosing to intentionally draw, is collusion. And gambling is placing a bet on a game, match, tournament, or any part of those. These are all relatively straightforward. A lot of people want collusion to include players having discussions about what is best for them and their friends outside of a match. So after round 8, before round 9, going into the final round before the cut to top 8, players want those conversations that occur outside of matches to be considered collusion. This is a hairy area, because a lot of people just have very strong feelings about it, frankly. And it's also one that is nigh impossible to police. Saying that players aren't allowed to have conversations outside of matches regarding match results at all, period, is like the way to... there's probably a slightly better way to phrase that rule. Like, players are not allowed to have conversations outside of their match, inside or outside their matches, regarding the outcome of their game, and then seek that resolution. But that's also not true, because I can talk with my friend and be like, yeah, I really need to win next round. Does me trying to win the next round count as collusion? No. It's okay, so we can say player has a conversation that leads to them desiring a draw or loss as opposed to a win, and then playing for that result or seeking that result in their next round. Okay, we do that, but how do we police? Like, one of the questions is, how do we police it and enforce it? Because if we start to police it and enforce it, that means that, like, players cannot receive text messages or utilize their phones in between rounds because they might have a conversation with somebody on site, or honestly even somebody off site. Or we have to check everybody's phone whenever they concede or draw and ask to look at their message receipts for the past day. What if 2 players, like, finish their round 8 matches in 20 minutes because they're both playing aggro decks, and then they leave the venue to go grab some food before round 9 and discuss it outside of the venue? Are we going to say players are not allowed to leave the venue? Furthermore, the act of choosing to draw is something that Hedkin says privacy violations everywhere. Yeah, like, It is not something that can be reasonably enforced. And so if it becomes policy, only the people who don't know how to get around it will be penalized by it. And the people who don't know how to get around it are the people who aren't doing it already. Right now, the people who are having these conversations about determining tournament math and what their best line is to get into top 8 are players who are highly competitive and have a bunch of friends at the events. These are the players who are advantaged by these conversations. And I think that the correct solution to this is, rather than saying you're not allowed to talk with friends about what's best for you to event, is to encourage other players to bring more friends to their events. If you're worried that you are at a disadvantage because you do not have enough people around you who know tournament math, get people around you who know tournament math. That's going to make you do better at events. And if they're invested in the game, they'll probably help you get better at the game as well. Playing against other skilled players helps you get better. So as long as players are allowed to concede and draw matches, which I anticipate being the outcome, players are allowed to have these conversations outside of matches, in part because a conversation that is held outside of a match of, let's say I talk with 3 of my friends and say, yeah, we should all draw because that'll be good for us for whatever reason. We go to our match. The people that I agreed to that I should draw with are not the people in my match. That's not. And so if I like, hey, do you want to draw? My opponent can very easily just say, nah, I'm good, we're playing. And then I'm locked into that, right? So that conversation doesn't directly lead to a result. It is only the conversation that happens in the match that has an impact on, a real impact on how the match is played. Alrighty. Cheating. A player knowingly breaks the rules, knowingly allows another player to break the rules, or lies to someone in a leader role in order to gain an advantage. Again, the player must be attempting to gain an advantage and must be aware that they are doing something illegal. If these requirements are not met, the infraction is not cheating and is handled by another part of the competitive policy guide. Cheating often appears as some other disruption and needs to be investigated to determine intent and awareness. If you cheat, you get disqualified. However, to cheat, we need to know that you are doing it on purpose. Making gameplay errors is not a reason to disqualify somebody, even if they make a lot of them. They're just bad at playing good. They're not cheating. This one is simultaneously the most straightforward. You're not allowed to cheat the end. And the most complicated, which is how do you determine whether or not somebody's cheating? Some people have asked for guidelines in the comprehensive event guide or the competitive policy guide to talk about investigations. That is not the place for cheating investigation lessons. That's going to come separately from Cascade, not from Fantasy Flight Games. But also keep in mind that the competitive policy guide is infraction, penalty, fix, examples, not all of, like, it is an incredibly valuable resource for judges, but it is not everything a judge needs to know. It is just the start of what you need to know. All right, stalling. It's the cheating form of slow play. There's an argument that stalling could be just listed as you are doing something illegal, slow play. You're doing it to gain an advantage, and you're aware that you're doing it, and it's not allowed. You could argue that stalling just falls under cheating. It is looking at a wide variety of other games. I think I was looking at like 5 or 6 other games for policy. All of them have a separate infraction for cheating and stalling. They are all divided. And I think that either it would need, we have, because slow play is already subjective, whereas pretty much the rest of uh, event disruptions and gameplay disruptions are objective, like inaccurate mandatory ability, open card manipulation error. We agree that those are objective. Deck error, objective. Tardiness is objective. Outside assistance is a little bit subjective sometimes, but honestly, most of the time, it's objective. Limited procedure violation is generally objective. Slow play is the only one where it's somebody's opinion. And so having a separate infraction for it allows us to go into broader philosophy and a little bit more examples. Even if it was cheating, we would have just all of these words crammed into cheating, and it would confuse cheating with stalling. And some people, it's just neater to have it spread out. Daniel says cheating. A criticism I heard a couple times is that the wording is definitive on the 3 criteria, in particular awareness of illegality. Basically, a judge said it was impossible to apply unless the player admitted intent somehow. It could probably be softened to mention subjectivity, investigation, determination of the judge. I think that's reasonable. Yeah, so player must be attempting to gain an advantage and must be aware that they're doing something illegal by the determination of the head judge after investigation. Yes, I can see that. We're just gonna snip this so that I don't have to type words, because sometimes I'm lazy. Great. Cheating, stalling, fraud. A player intentionally misrepresents who they are as a participant in a tournament or participates in a tournament that they are not a valid competitor for. Player registers under different UID to avoid suspension. A player registers under name and UID to help the owner of the UID earn a qualification. A banned or suspended player registers for an event. A player in competitive tier event is also on staff as judge for that event. So another thing, disqualification. Why is it separate from cheating? This is mostly for paperwork reasons. This is knowing that somebody has committed fraud is very important to FFG, because this is breaking the rules of Fantasy Flight Games and Asmodee for the first 3, and the fourth one is, while it's just policy, it undermines the integrity of the whole tournament in a way that isn't handled. Not only does this undermine the integrity of the tournament, it also undermines the integrity of tournament organizers and staff and organized play as a whole. So fraud while cheating undermines a tournament. If a player cheats in the event, the integrity of that tournament is compromised. If a player commits fraud in an event, the integrity of organized play is compromised, right? If somebody is able to play for somebody else, these don't impact just a single event. These impact all of organized play, which is why it is a separate infraction. Again, it could be a subcategory of cheating, but it is something that FFG wants to be particularly aware of. And so if somebody is disqualified for fraud, they want to know that. Finally, vandalism and theft. Player steals or intentionally damages materials from the event, venue, or another participant. This is just another one of crime isn't allowed at organized play events. Yep. I don't think I need to go into more detail of crime isn't allowed. You'll note that the example we had earlier in the conversation of the player who played in a limited event, captured a card from their opponent, dropped from the event, went home, discovered that they had a card, and then called the store and was like, hey, I have a common from my round 2 opponent or whatever. That is an extreme counterpoint to vandalism and theft. Like, if the player who had lost the card came up to us in round 6 and was like, hey, I just realized I'm missing this common, and I think my opponent in round 2 took it, we're not going to call up that player, be like, hey, do you have this common? We're going to disqualify you. You don't need to go that deep. But if somebody like takes a promo and it's just like, yeah, I'm gonna sell this, that's theft. That is not allowed. If somebody like uses Palpatine to take an Avenger, is like, oops, I forgot to give it back. Oh well, I guess it's mine now. That's a problem. There isn't. If somebody's just like, if you're like, hey, is there any chance you accidentally took a card from one of your opponents earlier? And they're like, oh yeah, I have an Avenger. Here it is. It's off in like a separate section of my sideboard or something along those lines. Then it's reasonable to be like, okay, you just haven't found somebody yet. If it's like in their trade binder, I have more questions. But yeah, theft is bad. Don't allow players to steal stuff. If they do, disqualify them. And that brings us to the appendices. Appendix A is just the infractions in the order that they're listed in the document, along with the default penalties. And then we get to the relaxed policy guide, which is where we started last Thursday. Yeah. Alrighty. I'm going to give folks another moment or two. Because that's it. We've covered everything. We've talked about all 92 pages of the comprehensive event guide. I hope that was a comprehensive reading of the comprehensive event guide. For those of you who were here for all, like, I don't know, 11 or 12 hours of this, thank you for joining me. For anybody who asked questions, thank you so much for asking those questions. I'm sure we're not going to be doing the ASMR version readings of these anytime soon, but hey, if you have any feedback, notes, etc., if there's anything that still doesn't make sense to you, whether you're here watching live or you're watching later on YouTube in the VODs, please either make a comment on YouTube, although I don't check comments on YouTube frequently. More effectively, ask a question in the December 9th thread that's talking about the comprehensive event guide update, or just shoot me a DM and be like, hey, this doesn't make sense to me. Can you help clarify it? Or just ask in Judge General or policy discussion. Just be like, hey, I have a question about new policy. How does this work? Either myself or somebody else will be more than happy to talk to you about it. And if it's something that you raise and other people are like, I'm also confused by this, it will very likely end up on my desk. And then, good Lord, I need to format these 6 pages of my notes. And then, how many pages of these notes? There are so many pages of notes. Okay, there are only like 3.5 pages of these notes. So yeah, there's somewhere between 6 and 10 pages of updates. A lot of those are grammatical updates, so you're not going to have to learn new things. A lot of them are also, those that aren't grammatical updates are adding some examples so that it's a little bit more refined, or typos, improving clarity. There are a couple places where like a word or half of a sentence is missing and it's just putting those back in, and generally does not change the intention or comprehension of those sections. But I plan on releasing... So, here's what's happening next. On Thursday, we get the last Scorekeeper lesson. Next Monday, we're going to have the Scorekeeper Introductory Certification exam. Then, with regard to the comprehensive event guide, I believe tomorrow I hope to release the first 2 of the updated lessons for level 2 covering the comprehensive event guide, starting with some stuff from communication. Then my ideal is 2 more on Thursday, 2 more on Friday, and then 2 more Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday of next week. And I think 12 lessons gets us across the finish line for all of the updated lessons for the comprehensive event guide for level 2. If I'm not able to hit 2 a day, I'm going to hit 1 a day. 1 a day updated is my minimum viable, in my opinion. And so that means that we should be done. Oh, let's look at a calendar real fast. If I'm doing 2 tomorrow and then 1, 2, I should be done by the end of the year, updating the level 2 lessons. So by January, we should have all revised level 2 lessons live. We should have the Scorekeeper cert live. And with that, I should also have the final batch of updates and fixes comprehensively laid out, which means that the policy clarifications page will be updated with everything that you need to know that isn't covered in these documents. Starkiller says, don't forget to celebrate the holidays. I'm not going to forget. I'm just going to maybe ignore them. I do have some holidays, personal holidays going on right now. It's called Path of Exile. It's a problem. It's not a problem. We have a great time with it. But with all that being said, thank you all so much for joining me, and I'll see you at the next one. Until next time, good luck and have fun.